The empire does not fall in a day. It fractures in silence. And King Vaelor Draven, the most feared alpha in the realm, is about to learn that the cruelest enemy isn't the one who takes your throne. It's the one who takes your heart and walks away like it meant nothing. This is the story of a man who chose power over love, only to discover that without her, he's already lost everything that matters. Stick around until the end, because this journey gets darker before it finds light. And if you're watching from your corner of the world, drop your city name in the comments and smash that like button. Let's build this tribe together. The throne room stretched before him like a cathedral of ambition. Obsidian pillars rose toward a vaulted ceiling inlaid with gold that caught torchlight and threw it back in fractured patterns. King Vaelor Draven sat motionless on the serpent throne, carved from a single piece of black stone veined with crimson, its armrests shaped like coiled serpents frozen mid-strike. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the symbolism brutal. Power never sleeps. Power never forgives. But tonight the hall felt different, empty in a way that had nothing to do with attendance. Vaelor's hands gripped the armrests. His knuckles were pale against the dark stone. Outside, the empire hummed with commerce and conquest. Inside, he was drowning in a silence so thick it pressed against his chest like a physical weight. 6 months. 6 months since he made the choice. The memory arrived without permission, sharp as a blade between ribs. Cerys Vael. Standing in the moon garden during the sacred rite, her scent hitting him like thunder. Wild jasmine and something else, something uniquely hers that made his wolf howl recognition in a language older than words. The bond snapped into place with such force it nearly drove him to his knees. Not a possibility, not a maybe. A certainty that rewired every instinct he possessed, and he sent her away. Vaelor exhaled slowly, forcing his breathing to steady. He'd made the logical choice, the strategic choice, the only choice a king in his position could make. Cerys was unclaimed, unconnected, politically worthless. Queen Consort Alira Voss brought 3 northern territories, 2 trade routes, and an alliance that prevented a war his empire couldn't afford. The math was simple, the decision inevitable. So why did it still feel like he'd ripped out his own spine? Footsteps echoed across marble. Vaelor didn't turn. He knew the rhythm of that walk. Measured, deliberate, weaponized grace. Alira appeared at the edge of his peripheral vision, a silhouette wrapped in silver and ice blue silk. Her hair was dark as midnight, pulled back severely to reveal a face that could have been carved by the same artist who sculpted the throne. Beautiful, remote, perfect. She stopped precisely 3 paces from the dais. The woman understood hierarchy the way a general understood terrain. "How long will you sit here alone, my king?" Vaelor's jaw tightened. "My king. Not Vaelor. Never Vaelor." 3 months married, and she still addressed him like a subordinate reporting to a commanding officer. "I'm considering border reinforcements," he said. His voice came out flat, controlled. Alira's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "At midnight? The border reports were filed hours ago. You've already issued orders. Then I'm considering them again." She ascended the first step, then the second. She moved like water flowing uphill, defying natural law through sheer discipline. When she reached him, she placed one perfectly manicured hand on his shoulder. Her touch was cool, impersonal. "The court is whispering," she said softly. "The court always whispers. Not like this. They say you're distracted, that your focus has shifted." Her fingers pressed slightly, not affection, but emphasis. "Weakness draws predators, Vaelor. You taught me that." He finally turned to look at her. Alira met his gaze without flinching. That was what made her formidable. She never flinched, never bent, never showed a crack in the armor. "I am not weak," he said. "Then stop acting haunted." The word landed like the stone in still water, sending ripples he couldn't contain. Haunted. Was that what they saw? Was that what he'd become? Alira withdrew her hand. "I've secured the Northern Lords for the trade summit next month. Lord Kessler was resistant, but I reminded him what happened to the last house that opposed our union." She paused. He fell in line. "Good. Good." She studied him with those analytical eyes, dissecting, cataloging. "That's all you have to say. What else is there?" "Recognition. Appreciation. You used to acknowledge strategic victories. Vaelor stood abruptly, forcing her to step back. The movement felt good. Aggressive. Real. You want appreciation? Fine. You're an excellent queen consort. You manage the nobility like a master conductor. You've stabilized trade agreements I thought unsalvageable. You are everything I needed to secure this empire, but not what you wanted. The silence that followed could have cut glass. Elira's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. Something almost human. Wants are luxuries, Vaelor. We both knew that when we accepted this arrangement. You wanted security, I wanted power. We both got what we bargained for. Did we? She held his stare for 3 full seconds, then turned and descended the steps with the same measured precision she'd used to climb them. At the threshold, she paused. The Alpha Council meets in 4 days. They'll be watching you. Whatever personal ghosts you're wrestling with, bury them. Or they'll bury you. She left without waiting for a response. Vaelor stood alone again. The throne room seemed larger now, colder. He walked to the eastern window, a massive archway that overlooked the capital city. Lights flickered like fallen stars across the landscape. Hundreds of thousands of people living, working, surviving under his rule. He'd built this, fought for every inch of territory, shed blood, both his and others, to carve an empire from chaos. And now it was his. Absolutely, unquestionably his. So why did it feel like ash in his mouth? His wolf stirred restlessly beneath his skin. The beast had been agitated for months, pacing, prowling, searching for something it lost. No amount of hunting or combat training satisfied it. The wolf wanted what the man had denied. It wanted her. Vaelor pressed his forehead against the cold stone of the window frame. The bond was supposed to fade. Every text, every elder, every piece of ancient wisdom said that rejected bonds weakened over time. Distance and denial would erode the connection until it became nothing more than a phantom sensation. They were wrong. If anything, it had grown stronger. He felt Ceres like a compass pointing north, not her location, but her existence. A persistent awareness that she was out there, breathing, living, surviving without him. And worse, thriving without him. That was the part that carved him hollow. The thought that she'd moved on, that their brief intersection meant nothing to her beyond an awkward moment at a ritual she'd stumbled into by accident. But he'd felt the bond. He knew she felt it too. The way her breath caught, the way her pupils dilated, the way her scent shifted from curious to devastated when he chose Elira. She knew, and she left anyway. No. He left her, sent her away with a dismissal so cold it still made him flinch in retrospect. A knock interrupted his spiral. Sharp, urgent. Enter. Marcus Thane, his head of intelligence, stepped through the door. The man was built like a siege weapon, all dense muscle and controlled violence, but his eyes were sharp enough to cut diamonds. He carried a leather folder tucked under one arm. My king. Marcus's voice was gravel and smoke. We have a situation. Vaelor didn't turn from the window. Define situation. Unrest in the southern provinces. 3 towns reported incidents this week. Supply caravans raided. A tax collector found dead in a ditch, and this morning someone burned an effigy of your likeness in the central square of Harrowmere. Vaelor's fingers curled into a fist. Harrowmere was a border town. Strategically irrelevant, but symbolically crucial. Acts of defiance there spread like infection. Who's organizing them? We're still gathering intelligence, but the common thread is interesting. Marcus opened the folder, pulled out a single sheet of parchment. They're not rebelling against taxation or trade policy. They're questioning your authority directly. Vaelor finally turned. Explain. Marcus approached, handing him the parchment. It was a crude propaganda leaflet, hand-printed and poorly illustrated, but the message was clear. The Alpha King falters. The bond was broken. The crown is hollow. Beneath the text was a rough sketch of a serpent eating its own tail. How did they know about the bond? Vaelor's voice dropped to a lethal register. Marcus's jaw tightened. We're investigating, but information like that doesn't stay contained, especially when palace servants talk. Someone saw something during the rite, or heard something. Once whispers start in a place like this, they travel faster than wildfire. Vaelor crumpled the parchment in his fist. Find the source. Cut it off. already in motion. But, sir, there's a larger problem. Marcus hesitated, which was rare for him. Hesitation meant the news was worse than insubordination. Your hesitation during last week's council session, when Lord Draymore challenged the Eastern border policy and you paused before responding. I was considering the options. You never consider options mid-session. You decide instantly. That's what makes you dangerous. Marcus leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. People noticed. And not just the council, guards, attendants. By evening, half the palace knew you'd faltered. I didn't falter. Then what would you call it? Vaelor wanted to argue, but the words died in his throat. Because Marcus was right. He had hesitated, just for a moment, just long enough. His instincts, usually razor sharp, had stuttered. And in a world where perception was power, a stutter was a death sentence. What are you telling me? Vaelor asked quietly. Marcus met his eyes. That the Empire senses weakness, and weakness attracts wolves. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications neither man wanted to voice. Double the patrols in the southern provinces, Vaelor said finally. Make examples of the raiders. Public. Brutal. I want the message clear. Considered done. Marcus paused. And the council meeting in 4 days? I'll handle it. Sir, if I may. Marcus chose his words carefully. You've been off balance since the mating rite. I don't know what happened there, and frankly, it's none of my business. But whatever it is, you need to bury it. Because if you don't, someone else will bury you in it. Vaelor's eyes flashed gold, his wolf surging forward. You forget yourself, Marcus? No, my king. I remember what you told me when you gave me this position. Marcus held his ground, fearless. You said you wanted advisors who would speak truth even when it endangered them. So here's the truth. You're compromised, and compromised kings don't last. Get out. Marcus bowed slightly, then turned and left without another word. Vaelor stood alone again, the crumpled propaganda leaflet still clenched in his fist. He looked down at it. The crude serpent drawing seemed to mock him. The bond was broken. The crown is hollow. He threw the parchment into the fireplace and watched it burn. But burning the evidence didn't erase the truth. 4 days later, the Alpha Council convened in the war room, a circular chamber designed to remind everyone that hierarchy existed even among predators. Vaelor sat at the head of the obsidian table, flanked by Alira on his right and Marcus on his left. 12 regional alphas occupied the remaining seats, each one a warlord in their own territory, bound to Vaelor through a combination of fear, respect, and calculated self-interest. Lord Draymore, an older alpha with silver threading his dark hair, spoke first. The southern unrest concerns us all, my king. 3 towns in open defiance. Trade routes disrupted. This is more than banditry. Vaelor's expression remained neutral. It's insurgency, and it will be handled. How? Lord Kessler leaned forward, his bulk making the chair creak. By burning more towns. That worked a decade ago when you were building the empire. But now? Now it looks like desperation. Careful, Kessler, Alira's voice cut through the room like a blade. You're questioning the king's methods. Kessler didn't back down. I'm questioning the king's focus. The room went deadly silent. Vaelor's eyes locked on Kessler. Say that again. Kessler met his stare. No disrespect intended, but the entire court sees it. You're distracted. Decisions that used to come instantly now take days. The eastern border policy still isn't finalized. The trade summit preparations are behind schedule, and now we have towns burning effigies of you. Because they sense hesitation, Lord Theron added, his voice oily and smooth. Predators smell blood in the water, my king. And right now, you're bleeding. Vaelor's hands flattened on the table. His claws extended slightly, scoring the obsidian surface. You think I'm weak? I think something happened, Draymore said carefully. And whatever it is, it's affecting your ability to lead. Vaelor stood abruptly. The motion was so sudden, so explosive, that 2 of the alphas flinched. He planted both hands on the table and leaned forward, his presence filling the room like a physical force. Let me clarify something, he said, his voice dropping to a register that made the air itself feel heavier. I have ruled this empire for 15 years. I've crushed rebellions that would have broken lesser kings. I've expanded our territory by 40%. I've built trade networks that fund every single one of your houses. And you dare question me because of a few malcontents in backwater towns? It's not just the towns, Theron said quietly. It's you. Vaelor's wolf surged forward, his eyes flashing full gold. What did you say? Theron didn't flinch. You heard me? The tension in the room was a living thing, coiled and ready to strike. Marcus stood, his hand moving to the hilt of his blade. Lord Theron, I'd choose your next words very carefully. But before Theron could respond, Alira's voice cut through. Enough! Everyone turned to her. She remained seated, composed, unshakable. You're all circling the same question without having the spine to ask it directly. She looked around the table, meeting each alpha's eyes. So I'll ask it for you. My king, what happened during the mating rite 6 months ago? Vaelor's entire body went rigid. Alira continued, her tone clinical. Rumors have spread. Whispers about a bond. About a woman who appeared and disappeared. About a choice you made. She tilted her head slightly. Were those whispers true? The room held its breath. Vaelor straightened slowly. What happens in the sacred rites is not subject to council review. That's not an answer, Kessler said. It's the only answer you'll get, Vaelor shot back. Then the whispers are true, Draymore said. You found your fated mate and rejected her. The silence that followed was absolute. Vaelor's jaw clenched so hard his teeth should have shattered. That bond was politically untenable. I made the choice that secured this empire. The choice that prevented a northern uprising and maintained stability across 3 regions. I chose the empire over personal desire. I chose all of you over her. And now the empire is fracturing anyway, Theron said softly. So what was the point? Vaelor's control snapped. He moved faster than thought, crossing the distance to Theron in a blur of motion. His hand closed around the man's throat, lifting him clear out of his chair. Theron's eyes went wide, his hand scrabbling uselessly against Vaelor's iron grip. The point, Vaelor snarled, was survival. The point was power. The point was ensuring that this empire didn't collapse into civil war. And if you question that choice again, I'll rip out your throat and mail it to your heir as a lesson in loyalty. My king, Marcus's voice was urgent. Release him. Vaelor held Theron for 3 more seconds, letting the man's face turn purple, before dropping him back into his chair. Theron gasped for air, clutching his throat. This council is dismissed, Vaelor said, his voice deadly calm. You'll receive my orders regarding the southern provinces by morning. And if I hear one more word about my personal choices, I'll start replacing council members with people who understand the meaning of obedience. He turned and strode from the room, leaving shocked silence in his wake. Alira followed him out, her expression unreadable. They walked in silence through the palace corridors until they reached the private wing. Only then did Alira speak. That was a mistake. Vaelor didn't slow his pace. They needed to be reminded who holds power. No, they needed to see a king in control. What they saw was a man on the edge of breaking. She moved in front of him, forcing him to stop. You almost killed Theron in front of the entire council. He deserved it. Deserve has nothing to do with it. She stepped closer, her voice dropping. You're unraveling, Vaelor. And every second you deny it, the Empire loses more ground. What do you want me to say? That I regret it? That I should have chosen her? I want you to admit that whatever you're feeling is destroying everything you've built. Vaelor stared at her, this woman he'd married for strategy, this perfectly calibrated instrument of political power. And for the first time since their union, he told her the truth. I can't stop thinking about her, he said quietly. Every decision I make, I wonder what she would think. Every time I enforce order, I feel her absence like a missing limb. The bond didn't fade, Alira. It's tearing me apart from the inside. Alira's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Then go find her. Vaelor blinked. What? You heard me. Go find her. Bring her back. Do whatever you need to do to fix this. She crossed her arms. Because if you don't, the Empire will fall anyway. And I didn't sacrifice my own choices to watch yours destroy us both. I can't leave. Not now. Not with the southern provinces in revolt and the council questioning my authority. Then you're already lost, Alira said simply. Because every day you stay here pretending you made the right choice, you prove them right. You're compromised, distracted, weakened. She turned to walk away, then paused. The greatest threat to this empire isn't rebellion or insurgency, Vaelor. It's a king who's already lost the only battle that ever mattered. She left him standing alone in the corridor. That night, Vaelor didn't return to the throne room. He went to his private chambers, locked the door, and allowed himself to do something he hadn't done in 15 years of rule. He stopped pretending he was in control. The bond pulsed in his chest like a second heartbeat, relentless and unforgiving. He could feel Saris out there, somewhere beyond the Empire's borders. Not her location, not her thoughts, just her existence. A constant reminder of what he'd chosen to sacrifice. He told himself it would fade, that distance and time would erode the connection until it became manageable, forgettable. But faded bonds didn't work that way. They burrowed into your soul and rewired everything you thought you knew about yourself. They turned instinct into agony and logic into torture. Every cell in his body screamed that he'd made the wrong choice, that power without her was meaningless, that an empire built on her absence was already crumbling. Vaelor walked to the window and looked out over the city. Somewhere out there, beyond these walls, beyond the borders he'd drawn and the territories he'd claimed, Saris was living a life that didn't include him, and the thought of it was killing him. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Go away," he called out. The door opened anyway. Marcus stepped inside, his expression grim. "We have a problem. Unless the palace is on fire, I don't care. The southern provinces just declared independence." Vaelor spun around. "What?" Marcus crossed the room, handing him a sealed letter. "It arrived an hour ago by messenger. 3 provinces. Unified coalition. They're claiming that a fractured alpha cannot hold a stable empire." She paused. "They're using your rejection of the fated bond as justification, calling it proof that you've lost the favor of the old gods and the instinct to lead." Vaelor tore open the letter and read it quickly. The words blurred together, but the message was clear. King Vaelor Draven has broken sacred law. A fated bond rejected is an alpha unmade. We no longer recognize his authority. The letter was signed by all 3 provincial governors. Vaelor crumpled the parchment in his fist. "This is orchestrated. Obviously." Marcus's voice was flat. "Someone's been planning this for months, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And your display at the council meeting gave them exactly the ammunition they needed. How many troops can we mobilize? Enough to crush the rebellion. But that's not the point." Marcus met his eyes. "If you put down this uprising with force, 10 more will rise in its place. Because they're not rebelling against your military strength, my king. They're rebelling against your legitimacy. I am the Alpha King. My legitimacy is absolute. Was absolute." Marcus's expression was grave. "Until you rejected a fated mate and proved that even you can be compromised." Vaelor felt the walls closing in. Everything he'd built, everything he'd fought for, all of it teetering on the edge of collapse because of one decision. One woman. What do I do? The question came out raw, stripped of the command and control that usually colored his words. Marcus was silent for a long moment. Then he said something Vaelor never expected. "Find her." "What?" "You heard me. Find the woman you rejected. Fix what you broke. Because if you don't, this empire won't last another year. And if she refuses?" Marcus's expression was unreadable. "Then you'll have your answer about whether the crown was ever worth the cost." He left Vaelor alone with a choice that shouldn't have existed. The empire or the bond. Power or truth. Everything he'd built or the one person who made him feel whole. Vaelor looked down at the crumpled letter in his hand. 3 provinces gone. More would follow. The council was fracturing, his authority eroding. And somewhere beyond these walls, Saris Vael was living a life that proved she didn't need him. But he needed her. The realization hit him like a warhammer to the chest. All this time, he'd told himself the bond was a weakness, a distraction, something to be controlled or eliminated. But standing here in the wreckage of his choices, he understood the truth. The bond wasn't the weakness. Denying it was. Vaelor walked to his desk and pulled out a blank sheet of parchment. His hand shook slightly as he began to write. Not orders. Not commands. A letter. To Saris Vael, wherever you are, whatever you've become. I was wrong. He stared at those 3 words for a long time. Then he crumpled the letter and threw it into the fireplace. Because words wouldn't be enough. If he was going to fix this, if he was going to reclaim what he'd thrown away, It would require more than apologies. It would require transformation. Vaelor turned from the flames and made a decision that would either save the empire or destroy it completely. He was going to find her, not as a king seeking to reclaim property, but as a man willing to lose everything to earn back the one thing that mattered. And if she refused him, then he would finally understand what it meant to be truly powerless. The empire could burn, but without her, he was already ash. The decision was made, but the execution was another beast entirely. Vaelor stood in his war room at dawn, maps spread across the table like the entrails of a dying empire. 3 southern provinces gone. Border skirmishes escalating, trade routes strangled. The machine he'd built with blood and calculation was seizing up, and every advisor in the palace knew exactly why. Marcus entered without knocking, carrying a leather satchel and a grim expression that had become his default in recent weeks. "The council is demanding an audience," he said flatly. "Lord Draymore is rallying support for a formal inquiry into your fitness to rule. Let them rally." Vaelor didn't look up from the maps. His finger traced a route westward beyond the Empire's borders into unclaimed territory. "By the time they convene, I'll be gone." Marcus set the satchel down with a thud. Gone where? To find her. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush stone. Marcus crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "You're abandoning the Empire in the middle of a fracturing crisis to chase after a woman who walked away 6 months ago. I'm fixing the mistake that caused the crisis in the first place." "That's not strategy, my king. That's desperation." Vaelor finally looked up, his eyes flashing gold. "Then what would you call staying here and pretending I can rule effectively while half my instincts are screaming that I'm incomplete? What would you call watching the Empire crumble because every decision I make is filtered through the noise of a bond I tried to sever?" Marcus studied him for a long moment. "I'd call it the cost of being a king." The words landed like a fist to the gut, but Vaelor didn't flinch. "Maybe that's the problem. Maybe the cost is too high." "You don't believe that." "I didn't." Vaelor straightened, his voice dropping to something rawer, more honest than he'd allowed in years. "But standing here watching everything I built fracture because I chose power over truth? I'm starting to think the old texts had it right. A bond rejected doesn't just weaken the alpha, it corrupts everything he touches." Marcus's jaw tightened. "So you're going to ride out there, find this woman, and what? Beg her to come back? Offer her a crown she already refused?" "I don't know." The admission came out quiet, almost vulnerable. "I don't have a strategy for this, Marcus. I don't have a battle plan. All I know is that staying here and pretending I made the right choice is killing me. And it's killing the Empire faster." There was a moment where Marcus looked like he might argue further. Then his shoulders dropped slightly, the rigid military posture softening just enough to reveal the man beneath the armor. "How long will you be gone?" "As long as it takes." "And if the southern provinces mobilize while you're away, if the council moves to replace you, then Elira will hold the line." Vaelor glanced toward the door, where he knew his queen consort was likely already awake, managing crisis communications with the precision of a surgeon. "She's more than capable. She's capable of maintaining what exists, not building what's lost." Marcus picked up the satchel and handed it to Vaelor. "I packed supplies. Enough for 2 weeks if you ration. There's coin, basic provisions, and a sealed letter of transit that doesn't bear royal insignia." Vaelor took the satchel, surprised. "You knew I'd go." "I know what a cornered wolf looks like." Marcus's expression was grim. "And you've been cornered since the day you sent her away." The observation cut deeper than it should have. "Keep the council distracted," Vaelor said. "Tell them I'm conducting reconnaissance in the southern territories. Buy me time. I'll buy you what I can. But Vaelor, if this goes wrong, if you come back empty-handed or not at all, there won't be an empire left to rule. Then I'd better not fail." Marcus nodded once, sharp and final. "Good hunting, my king." He left without ceremony. Vaelor stood alone in the war room, the weight of the satchel in his hand feeling heavier than any crown. He looked down at the maps one last time, lines and borders and territories that had consumed 15 years of his life. Kingdoms built on conquest, power secured through ruthless efficiency, and none of it meant anything without her. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like the first honest thought he'd had in months. He turned and walked out of the war room, leaving the maps behind. Elira was waiting for him in the private wing, dressed in riding leathers instead of her usual court silks. Her hair was pulled back in a tight braid, and there was something different in her eyes. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. "You're leaving," she said. Not a question. "Yes." She approached him slowly, her movements deliberate. "When I told you to find her, I didn't expect you to actually do it. You were right. The Empire is fracturing because I'm compromised. The only way to fix it is to fix what I broke." Elira tilted her head, studying him with that analytical precision that made her so dangerous. "And if she refuses you? If she's moved on and built a life that doesn't include a king who rejected her? Then I'll have my answer, which is that some choices can't be undone." Vaelor met her gaze. "And I'll live with that consequence." Elira was quiet for a moment. Then she did something unexpected. She reached up and adjusted the collar of his travel cloak, her fingers precise and impersonal. "I knew what I was getting into when I accepted this union," she said quietly. "I knew you didn't love me. I knew I was a strategic acquisition. And I made peace with that because power has always been more valuable to me than affection." Vaelor said nothing, sensing there was more. "But watching you deteriorate these past months, watching you try to function with half your instincts severed, it's made me understand something I didn't before." She stepped back, her expression unreadable. A fated bond isn't a luxury or a weakness. It's structural, and you can't build an empire on a broken foundation. "I'm sorry," Vaelor said. The words felt inadequate, but they were true. "You deserved better than a husband who was already bonded to someone else. I deserved a partner who was whole." Elira's voice was matter-of-fact. "So go. Find her. Do whatever it takes to become whole again, because a fractured king serves no one. What will you tell the council? That you're securing the southern border, that you're meeting with provincial leaders, that you're doing exactly what a king should do." She paused. "I'll hold the empire together while you fix yourself. But Vaelor, if you come back without resolving this, I won't protect you from the consequences." "Understood." Elira turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, I hope you find her, and I hope she's strong enough to make you earn it." She walked away before he could respond. Vaelor stood alone in the corridor, the weight of her words settling over him like armor. Then he turned and headed for the stables. The journey west was brutal in its simplicity. No royal escort, no banners or ceremony. Just Vaelor, a horse, and the bond pulling him forward like a rope tied around his ribs. He'd expected the connection to weaken with distance. Instead, it intensified. Every mile brought sharper clarity, like a frequency coming into focus. Not her exact location, but her direction, her presence. The undeniable certainty that she existed somewhere ahead of him. The landscape changed as he traveled. Manicured imperial roads gave way to rough trader paths. Fortified cities became scattered settlements. The Empire's influence faded like a stain washed thin, and with it Vaelor's identity as king became less relevant. Out here, he was just another traveler. No throne, no crown, no empire weighing on his shoulders. It should have felt diminishing. Instead, it felt like breathing for the first time in years. On the third day, he stopped at a way station, a rough-built structure that served as inn, tavern, and trading post for the scattered communities in the borderlands. The keeper was a grizzled woman, with scars that told stories and eyes that missed nothing. Vaelor paid for a room and a meal, keeping his face neutral, his presence forgettable. The common room was crowded with traders, drifters, and locals sharing road-worn stories over cheap ale. Vaelor took a corner table and listened. "Heard the southern provinces broke off from the Empire," one trader said, his voice carrying over the din. 3 regions just declared independence. "About time," someone else muttered. "King's been unstable for months. Word is he rejected his fated mate for a political marriage. No alpha survives that kind of fracture." Vaelor's grip tightened on his mug. The keeper appeared at his table, setting down a plate of bread and stew. "You're a long way from anywhere, stranger. What brings you west?" "Work," Vaelor said simply. She studied him with eyes that had seen too much to be fooled by simple lies. "You've got the look of a man running from something, or toward it." Vaelor met her gaze. "Does it matter which?" "Depends on whether you plan to bring trouble to my establishment." I don't. She nodded slowly, then leaned in slightly. There's a settlement about 40 miles west, a place called Ashenvale. Small, quiet. Folks there don't ask questions. You've got that same look, so I figured I'd mention it. Vaelor's instincts sharpened. What kind of settlement? The kind where people go when they don't want to be found. The keeper straightened. Just thought you should know. She walked away before he could ask more. Vaelor sat in the noise and smoke of the common room, processing. Ashenvale. The name meant nothing to him, but the bond in his chest pulled tighter, more insistent. She was there. He knew it the way wolves know north. He left before dawn, pushing his horse harder than was wise, driven by a need that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the howling certainty that every minute away from her was a minute wasted. Ashenvale wasn't on any imperial map. It existed in the cracks between territories, a collection of rough-built structures clustered around a central square. The people here moved with the cautious awareness of those who'd learned to survive outside formal protection. Vaelor dismounted at the edge of the settlement, every instinct screaming recognition. The bond thrummed in his chest like a second heartbeat, insistent and undeniable. She was here. He walked through the settlement slowly, taking in details. A blacksmith's forge, a general store, a small medical clinic. People glanced at him with the wariness reserved for strangers, but no one challenged his presence. And then he felt it, a shift in the air, a change in pressure. Vaelor turned. Saris Vale stood 30 feet away, frozen in the middle of the street like she'd walked straight into a wall. She looked different, harder. Her hair was shorter, pulled back in a practical braid. She wore simple work clothes, leather pants, and a worn jacket, nothing like the ceremonial attire she'd been wearing during the rite. But her eyes, those eyes that had haunted him for 6 months, were exactly the same. And they were staring at him with an expression that cycled through shock, recognition, and something that might have been fury. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world narrowed to just this, just her. Just the bond slamming back into full force with enough intensity to drive the air from his lungs. Then Saris's expression hardened into something cold and lethal. No, she said. The word was flat, final. She turned and started walking away. Vaelor moved without thinking, crossing the distance between them in seconds. Cerise, wait. She spun back, and the look on her face could have cut steel. Don't. Don't you dare say my name like you have any right to it. I need to talk to you. You needed to talk to me 6 months ago. Ceris's voice was low, controlled, but underneath it was a current of rage that made the air vibrate. Before you chose a crown over a bond. Before you looked at me like I was an inconvenience in your political strategy. Before you sent me away like I was nothing. You weren't nothing. Then what was I, Vaelor? She stepped closer, her eyes blazing. What was I worth in your grand calculation? How many territories did I cost you by existing? How much power did you gain by throwing me away? The words hit like physical blows, each one landing precisely where it would hurt most. I made a mistake, Vaelor said quietly. Saris laughed, sharp and bitter. A mistake. That's what you're calling it. Not a choice. Not a calculated decision to prioritize empire over everything else. A mistake. Yes. No. Saris's voice dropped to something more dangerous. You don't get to rewrite this. You made a choice, Vaelor. You looked at me, felt the bond, understood exactly what it meant, and you chose someone else. That wasn't a mistake. That was strategy. And now you're standing here in the middle of my life like you have any right to ask for a second chance. I'm not asking. Then what are you doing here? Vaelor met her eyes, letting her see the rawness he'd been hiding for months. I'm trying to fix what I broke. You can't fix this. Saris's hands clenched into fists. You don't understand what you did. You don't understand what it feels like to have a bond snap into place with such force that it rewires everything you thought you knew about yourself. And then watch the person on the other end look at you like you're a problem to be solved. I do understand. No, you don't. Because you had a choice. You had power and options and the ability to walk away. I had nothing. She took a shaky breath. I was nobody. No pack. No status. No political value. Just a woman who stumbled into a sacred rite by accident and felt something I didn't ask for and couldn't control. And you looked at me like I was an obstacle. That's not true. Then tell me what I was. The question hung between them, sharp and demanding. Vaelor's jaw tightened. You were everything. The moment you walked into that garden, the moment the bond hit, every instinct I had screamed that you were mine, that I was yours, that nothing else mattered, and yet you sent me away, because I was a coward. The admission came out raw, unfiltered, because I'd spent 15 years building an empire on control and calculation, and you represented something I couldn't predict or manage, because I was terrified of what it meant to need someone that badly. Ceres stared at him, her expression cycling through emotions too fast to name. So you chose safety, she said finally. You chose what you could control. Yes. And now what? Now that your empire is fracturing and your carefully managed strategy is falling apart. Now you want me? Now that I'm convenient again? No. Vaelor stepped closer, closing the distance she'd tried to maintain. Now that I understand what I lost. Now that I've spent 6 months trying to function without you and failing. Now that I've realized the empire means nothing if I'm hollow at the core. Pretty words, Vaelor. Ceres's voice was cold. But words are cheap. You had 6 months to come find me, 6 months to choose differently. And you didn't. I'm here now. Too late. The words landed like a death sentence. Vaelor felt something crack inside him, a fracture that went deeper than bone. Is that your final answer? Ceres held his gaze, her own eyes glittering with something that might have been tears or might have been rage. You don't get to show up here and expect me to fall at your feet because you finally decided I was worth your time. I've built a life here, Vaelor, a real life. I have work. I have people who care about me. I have stability. And the bond? The bond, she said bitterly, is something I live with. Every day, every hour, like a wound that won't heal because the person who caused it won't stop existing. I feel it too. Do you? Ceres stepped closer, invading his space with deliberate aggression. Do you feel it every time you touch your queen consort? Do you feel it when you're sitting on your throne making decisions that affect thousands of lives? Do you feel it when you're alone at night wondering if you were ever anything more than a political inconvenience? Every second of every day. Vaelor's voice dropped to something barely audible. It's tearing me apart, Ceres, and I deserve that. I deserve every moment of agony because I caused yours. She searched his face, looking for lies, for manipulation, for anything that would give her permission to walk away. But Vaelor had nothing left to hide behind. No crown, no strategy. Just the raw truth of a man who'd gambled everything and lost. Why now? Ceres asked finally. Why come here now instead of 6 months ago? Because 6 months ago, I still thought I could control it, that I could bury the bond and function through sheer force of will. Vaelor's hands trembled slightly at his sides. I was wrong. The bond doesn't weaken, it doesn't fade, it just carves deeper until there's nothing left but the hollow where you should be. Ceres's expression flickered, something vulnerable breaking through the armor. I don't know what you want from me, she said quietly. A chance. I gave you a chance 6 months ago. You chose someone else. Then let me earn a second one. How? Ceres's voice broke slightly. How do you earn back trust after destroying it? How do you fix a bond you shattered? I don't know. The honesty felt like stripping off skin, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Ceres was quiet for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Then she said the words that would change everything. I don't believe you. And before Vaelor could respond, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the middle of Ashenvale with the bond screaming in his chest and the empire crumbling at his back. Vaelor didn't follow. Not immediately. He stood in the center of the settlement, watching her disappear into a small clinic at the edge of the square, and forced himself to breathe through the instinct to chase, to claim, to force the confrontation to a conclusion. That was the old way. The king's way. And it had already failed once. He found lodging at a rough boarding house and spent the night staring at the ceiling, the bond pulling at him like a fishhook through his sternum. By morning, he'd made a decision. If she wouldn't listen to words, he'd show her through action. The settlement had problems. Vaelor could see them everywhere. A broken water system that left the eastern quarter without reliable access. A forge running on outdated equipment. Predator attacks on the outlying farms that went unanswered because no one had the resources to organize proper defense. He started with the water system. It took 3 days of hard labor, working alongside the settlement's engineer, a gruff man named Corvin who asked no questions and expected no explanations. They dug trenches, replaced corroded pipes, and rebuilt the distribution junction from scratch. Vaelor's hands blistered, his back ached. He worked until exhaustion made thinking impossible, and then he worked more. Sarah saw him. He felt her presence like pressure against his skin. She watched from the clinic windows, her expression unreadable. But she didn't approach. When the water system was fixed, Vaelor moved to the forge. The blacksmith, a woman named Kara, needed help expanding her operation to handle the settlement's growing population. Vaelor spent a week hauling stone, building structures, learning metalwork basics with the patience of a man who had nothing but time. People started to notice. The stranger who showed up asking nothing and giving everything, who worked without complaint and spoke only when necessary. Saris watched, always from a distance, always with that guarded expression that told him nothing had changed. But Vaelor kept working, because this was the only language he had left. Action instead of words, presence instead of promises. On the 14th day, he was repairing a fence line on the northern edge of the settlement when he felt her approach. The bond flared, announcing her presence before her footsteps did. He didn't turn, didn't stop working, just waited. "Why are you still here?" Saris's voice came from directly behind him. "Where else would I be? Ruling an empire, managing a crisis, playing king." Vaelor sank another post into the ground, testing its stability before responding. "The empire can survive without me for a while. This can't." "This?" He finally turned to face her. "Us." Saris's expression was complicated, layers of emotion he couldn't parse. "There is no us, Vaelor. You made sure of that." "Then why haven't you told me to leave?" The question hung between them. Saris crossed her arms, a defensive posture that told him more than words. "Because watching you work yourself to exhaustion trying to prove something is more entertaining than watching you sit on a throne." "Is that all it is? Entertainment?" "No." The admission came out quiet, almost reluctant. "It's confusing. You show up here claiming you've changed, claiming you understand what you threw away, and then you spend 2 weeks doing manual labor instead of trying to convince me with pretty speeches. Words failed the first time. Maybe action will succeed where strategy couldn't." Sari studied him, her eyes searching. "You really don't know if I'll forgive you, do you?" "No. And you're staying anyway." "Yes." "Why?" Vaelor set down the tools he'd been using and faced her fully. "Because you're worth it. Because the bond is real and permanent, and I can't unmake it any more than I can unmake gravity. Because I was wrong, and proving I've learned from that mistake is more important than pride or power or anything else." Saris's expression cracked slightly, something vulnerable bleeding through. "I hate that I still feel it," she said quietly. "The bond. Every time I see you, every time you're close, it pulls at me like a tide, and I hate it because it makes me weak. Feeling something real doesn't make you weak. It does when the person on the other end proved they can't be trusted." The words cut deep, but Vaelor didn't flinch. "Then I'll keep proving I can be, for as long as it takes. And if it takes forever, then I'll die trying." Saris looked at him for a long moment, emotions warring across her face. Then she did something unexpected. She stepped closer, not touching, not yielding, but closer. "The clinic needs help," she said. "We're overwhelmed. Too many patients, not enough hands. If you're serious about staying, about proving yourself, you can start there." Vaelor nodded. "When do I start?" "Now." She turned and walked back toward the clinic, not waiting to see if he'd follow. But the bond told him everything he needed to know. She hadn't forgiven him. She hadn't accepted him. But she hadn't sent him away. And for now, that was enough. Working in the clinic was different from physical labor. It required patience, precision, and the ability to face suffering without flinching. Saris ran the operation with the efficiency of a general and the compassion of someone who'd seen too much pain to waste it. She directed Vaelor through basic tasks at first, cleaning instruments, organizing supplies, assisting with patient intake. He followed her instructions without question, learning the rhythm of the work, the quiet intensity of healing. And he watched her. Saris with patience was a revelation. The guarded anger she showed him melted into something gentler when she worked. She spoke to frightened children with patience, handled difficult cases with calm authority, moved through the clinic like she'd been born to this work. This was who she'd become in his absence. Strong, capable, complete. And it destroyed him in the best possible way. On the third day in the clinic, a crisis arrived. A hunting accident in the outer territories. Multiple casualties. The clinic erupted into controlled chaos. Saris moved through it like a blade, issuing orders, prioritizing cases, working with hands that never trembled. Vaelor matched her pace, following instructions, anticipating needs, becoming an extension of her will. They worked for hours. When the last patient was stabilized, when the immediate danger had passed, Saris finally stopped moving. She stood in the center of the clinic, blood on her hands, exhaustion etched into every line of her body. Vaelor approached carefully. "You should rest." "I'm fine." "You're not." She looked up at him, and for the first time he saw past the armor to the person underneath. Tired, scared, human. "I can't rest," she said quietly. "If I stop moving, I'll start thinking. And if I start thinking, I'll remember. Remember what? That you felt like this once?" She gestured to the space between them. "That the bond made me feel like I'd found something I didn't know I was missing. And then you proved it was all an illusion. It wasn't an illusion." Vaelor's voice was rough. "It was real. It is real. I was just too much of a coward to choose it." Saris's eyes glistened. "You broke me, Vaelor. Do you understand that? You broke something fundamental, and I had to rebuild myself from pieces. And now you're here acting like you can just fix it with manual labor and good intentions. I don't think I can fix it." Vaelor stepped closer. "But I have to try. Because living without you isn't living. It's just existing." The vulnerability in his voice seemed to crack something in her defenses. Saris reached up and touched his face, her fingers gentle against his jaw. "This is real, isn't it? You really came here. You really gave up the Empire to find me." "I didn't give it up. I put it second, where it should have been from the beginning." Her hand trembled slightly. "I don't know if I can trust you. I know. I don't know if I can forgive you. I know that too." "Then what do we do?" Vaelor covered her hand with his, holding it against his face. "We start from here. No crowns, no strategies. Just two people trying to figure out if what's broken can be made whole." Saris closed her eyes, tears slipping free. "I'm so tired of fighting this." "Then stop fighting." Vaelor's voice was barely a whisper. "Just for tonight. Stop fighting and let yourself feel it." She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze with an expression that was equal parts hope and terror. And then she made a choice that would unravel everything. She kissed him. It wasn't gentle. It was desperate and furious, and 6 months of denied need crashing together like colliding storms. The bond ignited with such force that Vaelor's knees nearly buckled. Every nerve ending fired. Every instinct roared recognition. Mine. Saris pulled back first, her breathing ragged. "That doesn't mean I forgive you. I know. And it doesn't mean this is fixed. I know. But it means I'm willing to try." Her voice broke. "Even though I shouldn't, even though it's probably a mistake, I'm willing to try." Vaelor pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, breathing her in like oxygen after drowning. For the first time in 6 months, the howling emptiness in his chest went quiet. But outside Ashenvale, beyond the borders of this fragile moment, the Empire was still fracturing. And forces were already moving to ensure that Vaelor's choice would cost him everything. The kiss changed everything and nothing at the same time. Vaelor spent the next 3 weeks in Ashenvale, working alongside Saris in the clinic by day and navigating the fragile territory of rebuilding trust by night. They didn't speak about the future, didn't make promises they weren't ready to keep, just existed in the narrow space between what had been broken and what might be repaired. But the Empire doesn't stop bleeding just because a king decides to stop watching. The message arrived on a cold morning when frost still clung to the settlement's rough-built structures. A rider wearing imperial colors, his horse lathered from hard travel, his face grim with the weight of news no one wanted to deliver. Vaelor met him at the edge of Ashenvale, away from curious eyes. The rider dismounted, exhaustion evident in every movement. "My king," his voice was hoarse. "Marcus Thane sent me. The situation has deteriorated beyond control." Vaelor's jaw tightened. "How bad?" The rider handed him a sealed dispatch. 6 provinces now. The Southern Coalition has expanded. They formed a unified front and declared you unfit to rule. Lord Draymore has assumed command of the rebellion. They're marching on the capital. Vaelor broke the seal and scanned the contents. The words blurred together into a narrative of systematic collapse. Trade routes severed, alliances fractured, border defenses compromised. And at the center of it all, one undeniable truth. The Empire was eating itself alive. "What about Alira?" Vaelor asked quietly. "The Queen Consort has held the capital, but she's outnumbered. The council is divided. Half support her regency. Half are calling for new leadership. Marcus says you have 2 weeks at most before the city falls." Vaelor folded the dispatch slowly, his mind already calculating trajectories, probabilities, costs. 2 weeks to return, to rally what remained of loyal forces, to salvage an empire that was fracturing because its king had chosen to pursue something more important than power. The irony was sharp enough to draw blood. "Tell Marcus I'm coming," Vaelor said, "and tell Alira to hold the line whatever it takes." The rider nodded, mounted his horse, and disappeared back toward the Empire's borders. Vaelor stood alone at Ashenvale's edge, the dispatch heavy in his hand, and felt the weight of impossible choices settling over him like a shroud. He turned to find Ceres standing 20 feet away, her expression unreadable. "You heard?" he said. Not a question. The whole settlement heard. She approached slowly, her movements careful. A rider in Imperial colors isn't exactly subtle. "I have to go back. I know." The silence between them was loaded with everything they hadn't said, all the fragile progress they'd made threatening to shatter under the weight of reality. "This is what you were afraid of, isn't it?" Ceres's voice was quiet. "That choosing me would cost you everything. I'm not afraid of the cost." Vaelor met her eyes. "I'm afraid of losing you again. You're not losing me. You're choosing the Empire." Again, the words hit like a physical blow. "That's not fair," Vaelor said. "Isn't it?" Ceres stepped closer, her eyes blazing. "You came here. You spent weeks proving you'd changed. You made me believe that maybe, just maybe, you'd actually put me first for once. And now the first crisis that arrives, you're ready to run back to the throne. People are dying, Ceres. The Empire is collapsing. And what about us? What about the bond you claim was more important than power?" Vaelor's hands clenched into fists. "Don't make me choose. You already are." She gestured toward the direction the rider had gone. "You're standing here calculating strategies and probabilities and how fast you can get back to save your empire. That's choosing. What would you have me do? Let thousands die because I'm too selfish to intervene? I'd have you trust that maybe the empire doesn't need a king who's been broken by denying his own nature." Ceres's voice cracked. "I'd have you consider that going back might not save anything. It might just prove you learned nothing." The observation cut deeper than she could have known. Because standing there, feeling the pull of duty, warring with the bond that had finally started to heal, Vaelor understood something fundamental. The pattern was repeating. Crisis arrived, and his instinct was to return to what he knew: power, control, the throne. But that path had already failed once. "I don't know what to do," he admitted quietly. The vulnerability in his voice was raw, unfiltered. "Every instinct I have is screaming different directions." "Then maybe your instincts are the problem." Ceres's expression softened slightly. "You've spent your whole life being an alpha king, making decisions, controlling outcomes. Maybe it's time to stop controlling and start trusting. Trusting what? That some things are more important than empires." She closed the distance between them. "That you can't build anything lasting on a foundation you keep abandoning." Vaelor pulled her close, breathing in her scent, feeling the bond settle into place with the rightness of locked pieces. What if going back is the only way to end this? What if fixing the empire is what allows us to have a future? Or what if going back just proves that nothing has changed? That when faced with the choice, you'll always pick the crown? The question hung between them, unanswerable. Before Vaelor could respond, another sound interrupted. Hoofbeats. Multiple riders approaching fast. Vaelor's instincts flared. "That's not Imperial cavalry." They moved together toward the settlement center where a crowd was gathering. 6 riders entered Ashenvale, their armor bearing markings Vaelor recognized immediately. Draymore's forces. The lead rider dismounted, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt. His eyes scanned the crowd until they locked on Vaelor. "Well," the rider said, his voice carrying across the square. "Rumors were true. The fallen king hiding in the borderlands." Vaelor stepped forward, positioning himself between the riders and the settlement. "State your business. Lord Draymore sends a message." The rider pulled out a scroll and tossed it at Vaelor's feet. "You have 3 days to return to the capital and formally abdicate. Failure to comply will result in the execution of your queen consort and everyone loyal to your failed reign." The crowd murmured, fear rippling through them. Vaelor picked up the scroll, his expression carved from stone. "Draymore doesn't have the authority to issue ultimatums. He does now." The council voted. Unanimous decision. "You're officially deposed, Vaelor." The rider smiled, cruel and satisfied. "The only question is whether you return with dignity or we drag you back in chains. And the execution threat? Very real." The rider's smile widened. "Lord Draymore is particularly creative when it comes to demonstrating the cost of defiance. Your queen consort will die slowly, publicly, and every noble house that supported you will watch." Ceres's hand found Vaelor's arm, her grip tight. "Tell Draymore I'll consider his terms," Vaelor said, his voice deadly calm. "You have 3 days." The rider remounted. "And Vaelor? Bring the woman. Draymore is very interested in meeting the bond that destroyed an empire." The riders left, their laughter echoing behind them. The settlement erupted into frightened conversation. Vaelor stood frozen, the scroll clenched in his fist, the implications crashing down like a collapsing structure. Illyra was going to die. Everyone loyal to him would be executed, and Draymore wanted Ceres. The pattern recognition was instant. Draymore wasn't just opposing him, he was dismantling everything Vaelor had built and using Ceres as the final humiliation. "We need to leave," Ceres said quietly. "Right now." Vaelor looked at her, seeing the fear she was trying to hide. "Where would we go?" "Anywhere. Somewhere they can't find us." She pulled at his arm. "Vaelor, if we stay here, we're dead. If you go back, you're dead. The only option is to run." "Run where? Beyond the borderlands? Into unclaimed territory where we'd be hunted for the rest of our lives? Better hunted and alive than captured and executed." Vaelor's mind raced through possibilities, each one narrowing into impossibility. Running meant abandoning Illyra to torture and death, meant letting everyone who'd been loyal to him die for his choices. Running meant proving that Draymore was right, that a king who chose a bond over duty deserved to lose everything. But going back meant walking into a trap, meant surrendering to forces that would use Ceres against him in ways that made death look merciful. There was no good choice, only terrible options, and the certainty that someone he cared about would suffer regardless of what he decided. And then understanding arrived like a blade between ribs. This was the pattern. The same impossible choice presented in different clothing. Power or bond. Empire or love. Control or surrender. And every time he chose power, everything else turned to ash. Vaelor looked at Ceres. Really looked at her, and saw the truth he'd been avoiding. She was right. Going back wouldn't save anything. It would just prove he was still the same broken king who valued strategy over truth. But letting Illyra die wasn't an option either, which meant there was only one path forward, one that required him to stop being a king and become something else entirely, something more dangerous. "I'm not running," Vaelor said quietly, "and I'm not surrendering." "Then what are you doing?" "Starting a war." The planning took 12 hours. Vaelor gathered every able fighter in Ashenvale, 17 people total, most of them settlers who'd fled violence in other territories and had no desire to return to it. But they listened when he explained the situation. And more importantly, they listened when Ceres vouched for him. "We can't match Draymore's forces in open combat," Vaelor said, maps spread across the clinic's main table. "But we don't need to. We just need to create enough chaos to extract Illyra and destabilize his command structure." "That's suicide, Corvin," the settlement's engineer said flatly. "You're talking about attacking a military force 10 times our size. I'm talking about precision strikes." Vaelor's finger traced routes on the map. Draymore is consolidating power, which means his forces are spread thin. The capital garrison is loyal to him, but the outer territories are less certain. We hit supply lines, disrupt communications, make him divide his attention. And then what? Kara, the blacksmith, leaned forward. Even if we somehow extract the queen consort, Draymore still controls the empire. You'd be a king without a kingdom.
I'm already a king without a kingdom.
Vaelor met her eyes. This isn't about reclaiming the throne. It's about preventing mass executions and stopping a tyrant from consolidating power through terror. Why should we help you? Someone from the back asked. Most of us came here to escape empire politics. Why risk our lives for your mess? Vaelor had expected the question, had prepared logical arguments about how Draymore's expansion would eventually threaten even borderland settlements, about how tyrants never stopped with one conquest. But looking at these people who'd built lives outside the Empire's shadow, he understood that logic wouldn't move them. Only truth would. Because if I don't try to stop this, Vaelor said quietly, I'm proving that power is all that matters, that bonds and loyalty and choosing to be better than your worst instincts means nothing. And if that's true, then everything I've learned here was pointless. The room was silent. Then Sarah stepped forward. I'm going with him. Vaelor turned to her, shock evident. Absolutely not. You don't get to make that choice for me. Her voice was steel. If you're walking into a trap designed to use me against you, I'd rather be there than hiding. It's too dangerous. Everything about this is dangerous. Sarah's crossed her arms. But I'm not letting you face it alone. Not again. The determination in her eyes told him arguing would be pointless. Corvin sighed heavily. This is the stupidest plan I've heard in 20 years. Does that mean you're in? Vaelor asked. It means if I'm going to die, I'd rather die doing something ridiculous than sit here waiting for Draymore's forces to show up anyway. He looked around the table. Who else is stupid enough to follow a deposed king on a suicide mission? Slowly, hands raised, not all of them, but enough. Kara looked at Vaelor with an expression that might have been respect. You'd better have a real strategy and not just noble intentions. Vaelor pulled out detailed reconnaissance reports Marcus had sent over the weeks, information he'd been cataloging without fully realizing why. The capital has 3 entry points. The main gate is heavily fortified, but there's a supply tunnel that runs beneath the eastern wall. It was built as an emergency escape route. Almost no one knows it exists. How do you know about it? I designed it. The room processed that information. And you think Draymore hasn't secured it? Corvin asked. He doesn't know it exists. Only 3 people were present when it was built, and 2 of them are dead. Vaelor's expression was grim. It's our only advantage. Assuming it hasn't collapsed in the meantime, Kara said, or been discovered, then we die in a tunnel instead of in the open. Vaelor met each person's eyes. I won't lie to you. This plan has maybe a 30% chance of success. Most of us probably won't survive. But if we do nothing, the Empire falls to a tyrant who will spread his control like cancer until every settlement from here to the Western Sea is under his boot. The silence was heavy with the weight of terrible choices. We leave at dawn, Vaelor said. Anyone who wants to back out has until then. No judgment, no consequences. The gathering dispersed slowly, people returning to their homes to make whatever preparations seemed necessary when facing probable death. Sarah stayed behind, waiting until they were alone. 30%? She said quietly. I was being generous. The real number is closer to 15, and you're doing this anyway. Because the alternative is worse. Vaelor turned to face her. If I let Draymore execute Illyra and consolidate power through terror, I'm proving that everything I claim to have learned was performance. That when tested, I'm still the same king who chooses strategy over humanity. This isn't strategy. This is revenge. No. Vaelor's voice was firm. Revenge would be trying to reclaim the throne. This is about stopping an execution and destabilizing a regime built on fear. Whether I survive or not is secondary. Ceres studied him for a long moment. You've changed. Have I? The old Vaelor would have calculated odds and made the choice that preserved his own position. She stepped closer. This version is willing to die for people he already abandoned. That's different. Different doesn't mean better. Maybe not, but it means real. Vaelor pulled her close, feeling the bond settle between them like an anchor. If this goes wrong, if I don't make it back, you need to run. Get as far from the Empire as possible. I'm not running. Ceres? No. Her voice was absolute. We do this together or not at all. The determination in her eyes told him arguing would change nothing, so instead, he kissed her. Not desperate this time, but deliberate, a promise made without words. When they finally separated, Ceres's expression was complicated. We're probably going to die, she said. Probably. And you're okay with that? Vaelor considered the question honestly. A month ago, the thought of dying would have been unthinkable. Kings didn't die in pointless raids, they died old and bitter on thrones built from compromises. But standing here with Ceres, facing a mission that would probably end in blood and failure, he felt more alive than he had in 15 years of rule. If I die trying to be better than I was, he said quietly, that's a better death than surviving as what I used to be. Ceres's eyes glistened. That's either very brave or very stupid. Can it be both? She laughed, sharp and broken. We're definitely going to die. Then let's make it count. They left Ashenvale before dawn, 17 fighters, armed with desperation, and a plan so thin it barely qualified as strategy. The journey to the capital took 4 days of hard travel through terrain that grew increasingly hostile as they approached Empire territory. Vaelor felt the shift in the land itself. Where Ashenvale had been rough but alive, the Empire's borders felt compressed, controlled, everything forced into rigid order. They reached the capital's outskirts on the 5th night. The city sprawled before them, lights glittering like a field of predator eyes. Vaelor had built this. Every street, every structure, every carefully calculated expansion designed to project power and permanence. Now it looked like a tomb. The supply tunnel entrance was hidden in a collapsed aqueduct 3 miles from the eastern wall. Vaelor found it exactly where memory insisted, the concealed hatch buried under debris and neglect. Corvin examined the structure with an engineer's critical eye. This hasn't been opened in years. Could be collapsed inside. Only one way to find out. Vaelor pulled the hatch open, revealing darkness and the smell of stale air. They descended single file into a passage barely wide enough for one person. The walls were rough stone, the floor uneven and treacherous. Vaelor led, his enhanced senses navigating through darkness that would have been absolute to human eyes. Behind him, he felt Ceres's presence like a second heartbeat, steady and certain. The tunnel stretched for what felt like miles, occasionally branching into passages Vaelor didn't remember. Twice they hit collapsed sections and had to backtrack. The third time, the collapse was total. We're blocked, Kara whispered from behind. Vaelor examined the debris. Fresh. This was deliberate. His instincts flared warning half a second before the attack came. Lights erupted from both directions, blinding after the darkness. Armed soldiers poured from hidden alcoves, surrounding them with weapons drawn and expressions that promised violence. And at the center of the force, stepping into view with a smile that could cut glass, was Lord Draymore himself. He was older than Vaelor remembered, silver threading his dark hair, but his eyes were sharp and calculating. He wore armor that mixed ceremonial and practical, a man who understood the theater of power. King Vaelor, Draymore said, his voice echoing in the confined space. How predictable. Did you really think I wouldn't anticipate this exact maneuver? Vaelor's hand moved to his weapon, but a dozen crossbows trained on him before he could draw. Around him, Ashenvale's fighters were similarly covered, outnumbered 5-1. How did you know? Vaelor asked, buying time his mind could use to calculate escape routes that didn't exist. Because I know you, Vaelor. Draymore stepped closer. 15 years I've watched you rule, studied your patterns, your predictable combination of arrogance and strategy. He gestured to the tunnel. You designed this escape route. Of course you'd use it when desperate. Then why let us get this far? Theater. Draymore's smile widened. I wanted you to feel hope before I crushed it. Wanted you to believe you might actually save your pathetic queen consort before I demonstrated exactly how powerless you've become. Where is Elira? In the palace. Alive. For now. Draymore's eyes shifted to Ceres. But I'm more interested in her, the famous fated bond that destroyed an empire. She's less impressive than I imagined. Leave her out of this, Vaelor growled. Out of this? Draymore laughed. She is this. The entire justification for your deposition. The proof that you valued personal desire over imperial stability. He approached Ceres slowly, predator-like. Tell me, girl, was he worth it? Was your bond worth watching thousands die in the chaos his absence created? Ceres met his eyes without flinching. I didn't create the chaos. The Empire did, by building a system where power matters more than humanity. Draymor's expression flickered, something darker moving beneath the surface. Philosophical. I like that. It'll make breaking you more interesting. Touch her and I'll rip out your throat, Vaelor snarled, his wolf surging forward. With what? Draymor gestured to the crossbows still trained on them. You're surrounded, outnumbered. Your little rescue attempt failed before it began. The only question now is how many of your followers die before you surrender. I'm not surrendering. Then they all die. Draymor's voice went cold, starting with her. He gestured, and two soldiers grabbed Ceres, forcing her to her knees. Vaelor's control shattered. He moved faster than thought, breaking through the line of soldiers with raw strength and fury. 3 went down before crossbow bolts slammed into his shoulder and thigh, driving him back. He collapsed to one knee, blood spreading across stone, his vision tunneling. Predictable, Draymor said. I knew you'd break discipline for her. That's what makes you weak, Vaelor. That's what makes you unfit. A true king sacrifices everything for the Empire. You couldn't even sacrifice one woman. Vaelor looked up, blood running down his arm, and saw Ceres's face. She wasn't crying, wasn't pleading, just watching him with an expression that contained everything they'd never said to each other. And in that moment, staring at certain death with the bond screaming in his chest, Vaelor understood the final truth. Draymor was right, not about weakness, but about sacrifice. A true king did sacrifice everything, but not for the Empire, for what the Empire was supposed to protect. People, bonds, the fundamental connections that made power mean something beyond conquest. Vaelor had spent 15 years building an empire on control and strategy, and it had given him nothing but a throne that felt like a cage. But these last weeks in Ashenvale, working beside Ceres, choosing connection over command, he'd felt more like himself than in his entire reign, which meant there was only one choice left, the choice he should have made 6 months ago. Vaelor looked at Draymor and smiled, blood on his teeth. You're right. I am weak. Too weak to be the king you think the Empire needs. Draymor's expression shifted, confusion flickering. But I'm strong enough to be the man she deserves. Vaelor's voice dropped to something raw and absolute. So here's my offer. Let them go. All of them. Take me. Execute me. Make whatever example you want. But let them leave. No, Ceres gasped. Vaelor, don't. It's the only way. Vaelor held her gaze. And we both know it. How touching, Draymor said, but insufficient. I want you broken, Vaelor, and the only way to break you completely is to make you watch her die first. He drew his blade and pressed it against Ceres's throat, and that was when everything Vaelor had been holding back finally detonated. The transformation was instantaneous, violent. His wolf surged forward with such force that the crossbow bolts in his body were expelled by sheer power. Bone and muscle restructured, his eyes went full gold, then beyond gold into something ancient and terrible. An alpha apex, the rarest form. The transformation reserved for moments when survival required becoming something more than human. Draymor's expression shifted from confidence to fear in the span of a heartbeat. Vaelor moved through the soldiers like they were standing still, each strike precise and devastating. Claws tore through armor. Strength that had been suppressed for years of civilized rule finally unleashed without restraint or mercy. He reached Draymor in seconds, his hand closing around the man's throat, lifting him clear off the ground. You wanted to see me broken? Vaelor's voice was layered, human and wolf, speaking simultaneously. This is what breaks. He threw Draymor against the tunnel wall hard enough to crack stone. The remaining soldiers backed away, their weapons trembling in hands that suddenly understood they were facing something beyond tactical calculation. Vaelor stood in the center of the carnage, blood and fury and 15 years of suppressed nature finally free, and felt the bond flare with such intensity it was almost painful. He turned to find Ceres staring at him, not with fear, but with recognition. This was who he actually was. Not the controlled king, not the strategic alpha, but something wilder, more honest, more real, and she wasn't afraid. Go! Vaelor growled, his voice still layered. "Take everyone and run." "Not without you," Sarah said. Vaelor looked at her, then at the tunnel filled with dead and wounded soldiers, then at Draymore struggling to breathe against the wall, and made a choice that would define everything that came after. He released Draymore, stepped back, let the Apex transformation fade until he was just a man again, bleeding and exhausted and finally completely certain of who he was. "We all go," he said quietly. "Or none of us do." Sarah crossed to him, her hand finding his. "Together." Draymore coughed, blood on his lips. "You're making a mistake." "No." Vaelor met his eyes. "I'm making a choice, the one I should have made from the beginning." He turned his back on the man who'd tried to destroy him, on the empire he'd built, on 15 years of carefully constructed power, and walked toward the tunnel's exit with Saris's hand in his and Ashenvale's fighters at his back. And for the first time in his life, Vaelor Draven felt completely, devastatingly free. They didn't make it 20 feet before the tunnel collapsed behind them. The explosion was deliberate, calculated, the sound of stone grinding against stone echoing through the passage like the Empire itself was trying to swallow them whole. Draymore had triggered a failsafe, sealing the tunnel and trapping them between collapsed rock and the exit that suddenly felt impossibly far away. "Move!" Vaelor barked, his voice cutting through the panic. "Now!" They ran through darkness that pressed against them like a living thing, the walls groaning with structural damage, dust choking the air until breathing felt like drowning. Vaelor could hear his fighters behind him, their footsteps uneven, fear making them clumsy. Saris ran beside him, her hand still locked in his, and that contact was the only thing keeping his instincts from spiraling into pure violence. The tunnel branched ahead. Vaelor's memory screamed wrong directions. Everything shifted from when he'd designed it years ago. Time and neglect had rewritten the map. "Left or right?" Corvin gasped from behind. Vaelor closed his eyes, letting instinct override logic. The bond pulled him right with certainty that had nothing to do with memory and everything to do with survival. "Right. Follow me." They plunged deeper into passages that narrowed until they were moving single file, the ceiling so low Vaelor had to hunch. His wounds from the crossbow bolts had reopened during the Apex transformation, blood running down his arm and leg, each step leaving red prints on stone. Behind them, voices echoed. Draymore's soldiers pursuing through the rubble, hunting them like wolves tracking wounded prey. "They're gaining," Kara said, her voice tight. Vaelor's mind raced through impossible calculations. They couldn't outrun trained soldiers, couldn't fight them effectively in confined space with limited weapons and half his people already injured, which left only one option. He stopped abruptly, causing Saris to nearly collide with him. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "Buying time." Vaelor turned to face the way they'd come. "Keep going. Follow this passage to the end. It should exit near the eastern docks." "Should?" "Will." His voice was absolute. "Get everyone out. Get to the boats." "And you?" "I'm creating a distraction." "No." Saris's grip on his hand tightened. "We're not splitting up. We don't have a choice. There's always a choice." Vaelor looked at her, this woman who'd become the center of everything he valued, and felt the bond between them vibrate with the certainty of what he had to do. "You were right before," he said quietly. "When you said I kept choosing the Empire over you, over us. But not this time. This time I'm choosing to make sure you survive, even if it costs me everything. That's not choosing me. That's choosing to be a martyr. It's choosing to be what you needed me to be 6 months ago." Vaelor touched her face, memorizing the feel of her skin. Someone willing to sacrifice power for what actually matters. The footsteps behind them grew louder. "Go," Vaelor said. "Please." Sarah stared at him, emotions warring across her face. Then she did something that broke and remade him simultaneously. She pulled him down and kissed him hard enough to bruise, the bond igniting between them with such force it felt like lightning in his veins. When she finally pulled back, her eyes were fierce. "You come back to me," she said, "or I'm coming after you." Then she turned and ran, taking Ashenvale's fighters with her. Vaelor watched until they disappeared into darkness. Then he turned to face the pursuing soldiers, his wolf rising to the surface with a hunger that had been suppressed for too long. He'd spent 15 years being a civilized king, calculated, controlled, strategic. Time to remember what it meant to be a monster. The soldiers found him standing in the center of the passage, blood-soaked and smiling. There were 12 of them, armed and armored, led by a lieutenant whose expression suggested he'd seen combat before and wasn't impressed by one wounded alpha blocking their path. "Stand down," the lieutenant ordered. "You're surrounded and injured. This doesn't have to end badly." Vaelor's smile widened, showing teeth. "Yes, it does." He moved before they could process the threat, the apex transformation rippling through him faster this time, more controlled. Not full shift, just enough to enhance speed and strength beyond human limitation. The first 3 soldiers went down before they could raise their weapons. Claws through armor, strength that shattered bone. Violence so precise and brutal it redefined what combat meant in confined spaces. There is a moment in every fighter's life when training becomes irrelevant, when the opponent standing before you operates on a level so fundamentally different that all your preparation means nothing. These soldiers had drilled for rebellions, for coordinated assaults, for enemies that followed predictable patterns. They had not trained for facing something that existed outside the boundaries of what they understood as possible. The lieutenant managed to get his blade up, managed to score a deep cut across Vaelor's ribs before Vaelor's hand closed around his throat and slammed him against the wall hard enough to crack stone. "Where is Elira?" Vaelor growled, his voice layered with wolf and fury. The lieutenant's eyes widened. "Palace. 3rd floor. Northwest tower. Alive? For now." Vaelor squeezed slightly, not enough to kill, just enough to emphasize the question. Draymor's plan. Public. Execution. Tomorrow. Dawn. The words came out strangled. Example. For anyone who opposes. Vaelor released him, letting the man collapse. Then he turned to the remaining soldiers, all of whom had backed away, their weapons trembling. "Go back to Draymor," Vaelor said quietly. "Tell him if he touches Elira, I'll burn the Empire to ash and salt the ground where it stood." He didn't wait for a response, just turned and ran in the direction Saris had gone, leaving the soldiers too terrified to follow. The tunnel exit was exactly where memory insisted, hidden behind a false wall that opened onto the eastern docks. Vaelor emerged into night air that tasted like freedom and found Saris waiting with Corvin and the others. She crossed to him immediately, her hands checking his wounds with practiced efficiency. "You're bleeding everywhere," she said. "I'm fine." "You're not. I'm alive." "That's close enough." Vaelor looked around. "Everyone make it?" Corvin nodded grimly. Kara took a crossbow bolt to the shoulder. "But she'll live. We're down 2 fighters who didn't make it through the collapse. The losses hit harder than they should have. People who'd followed him knowing death was probable, who'd trusted his impossible plan and paid the price. There was a moment where the weight of those deaths threatened to crush him, where the old instinct to retreat into strategic calculation almost won. Leadership had always been easier when he could reduce casualties to numbers, when dead soldiers were statistics instead of faces. But standing here with their absence carved into the group like missing teeth, Vaelor felt every loss as a personal failure. This was the cost of being human instead of being a king. Kings counted bodies. Humans mourned them. "We need to move," Corvin said, his voice rough. "Draymor's forces will secure the docks soon." "Not yet." Vaelor's voice was steel. "Elira is alive. 3rd floor of the palace, northwest tower. Dawn execution scheduled." "Then she's already dead," Kara said flatly, binding her wounded shoulder with strips torn from her shirt. "There's no way to reach the palace before Draymor locks it down completely." "There's always a way. Not without an army." Vaelor looked at the ragged collection of fighters surrounding him. Exhausted. Wounded. Down to 15 people against an empire's worth of soldiers. The logical choice was clear. Run. Get Saris to safety, abandon Elira to her fate, and live with the guilt. But logic had already failed him once. Logic was what convinced him to choose power over the bond. Logic built empires on foundations that crumbled the moment real pressure arrived. Instinct, though. Instinct understood what logic never could, that some debts could only be paid in blood and fire. That a man who abandoned people twice wasn't a man worth being. "I'm going back," Vaelor said quietly. "Anyone who wants to leave, no judgment. but I'm getting Elira out even if I have to tear the palace down stone by stone. That's not a plan, Corvin said. That's suicide with extra steps.
Then call it what it is. Vaelor met his eyes. I abandoned her once already by leaving the Empire. I won't do it again by letting Draymore execute her while I run. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of impossible choices. Then Sarah stepped forward. I'm going with you. Absolutely not. She crossed her arms, her expression immovable. You don't get to protect me by getting yourself killed. We do this together. Saris, this isn't your fight.
Yes, it is. Because you're my fight, and wherever you go, I go. She looked around at the others. All of us or none of us? That's how this works, Vaelor wanted to argue. Wanted to order her to safety. Wanted to use every strategic argument he'd mastered over 15 years of rule. But looking at her face, seeing the determination that made her who she was, he understood that trying to protect her by excluding her would just prove he hadn't learned anything. So instead of arguing, he nodded. Together, he said. Together, she agreed. Corvin sighed heavily. This is officially the stupidest thing I've ever been part of. He looked at the others. Who else is dumb enough to assault a fortified palace with 15 people in a prayer? Slowly, every hand raised. Not because the plan was sound, not because success seemed likely, but because something in Vaelor's raw honesty, his willingness to die for debts that logic said he should abandon, resonated with people who'd spent their lives being told that survival meant compromise. There is a particular kind of courage that only emerges when people have nothing left to lose. Not the calculated bravery of soldiers following orders, but the reckless defiance of those who've decided that dying on your feet beats living on your knees. Vaelor saw it in every face around him. These weren't warriors. They were survivors who'd finally found something worth the risk. Kara pulled out a rough map of the palace grounds she'd sketched from memory. If we're doing this, we need actual strategy, not just noble intentions. What are the access points? Vaelor studied the map, his mind shifting into tactical mode. The main gates are suicide, but there's a servant's entrance on the south wall. Minimal guard presence because it's considered too small for serious assault. How do you know? I used it myself when I wanted to move through the palace unseen. Vaelor's finger traced the route. It leads to the lower kitchens. From there we can reach the interior stairwells. And the tower where they're holding the queen consort? Northwest corner, 3rd floor. 2 guards minimum, probably more given the circumstances. We'd need to fight through 3 levels of palace security to reach it. So impossible, someone muttered. Vaelor looked up from the map. I've built my entire reign on making impossible situations inevitable. One last time won't kill me. Actually, it probably will, Corvin said. But I appreciate the confidence. They planned through what remained of the night, each person contributing knowledge that seemed insignificant until combined. Kara knew the guard rotation patterns from when she'd worked palace forges years ago. Corvin understood structural weak points from construction projects he'd overseen. Saris had medical expertise that could keep people alive long enough to matter. By the time false dawn began lightening the eastern sky, they had something that resembled a plan. It was terrible, full of holes and assumptions, required luck and timing, and the kind of precision that 15 exhausted fighters couldn't reliably deliver. But it was all they had. The servant's entrance was exactly where Vaelor remembered, hidden behind overgrown vegetation that suggested it hadn't been used in years. 2 guards stood watch, bored and inattentive, clearly not expecting serious threat from a passage most people had forgotten existed. Vaelor approached alone, his hands visible, his posture non-threatening. The guards straightened, hands moving to weapons. I need to speak with Lord Draymore, Vaelor said calmly. The guards exchanged glances. You're supposed to be in the tunnels. Plans changed. Vaelor stepped closer. I'm here to negotiate terms. What terms? My life for the queen consorts. Fair trade. The guards hesitated, uncertainty evident. This wasn't protocol. This was a former king surrendering voluntarily, which felt too easy to be real. That hesitation was all Vaelor needed. He moved fast, disarming the first guard and using the man's own blade to incapacitate the second before either could call alarm. Not killing strikes, just enough to remove them from the equation. Corvin and the others emerged from hiding, moving through the entrance with practiced silence.
Inside, the palace was exactly as Vaelor remembered. Obsidian walls, gold inlay, the architectural expression of power and permanence. It felt like a mausoleum now, like walking through the corpse of something that had died without anyone noticing. They moved through servants' corridors, avoiding main passages, using knowledge Vaelor had accumulated over 15 years to navigate without detection. But the palace had changed. New guard posts, altered patrol routes. Draymore had reorganized security with someone else's tactical mind, someone who understood Vaelor's patterns and had systematically eliminated his advantages. At the second stairwell, they encountered a full patrol. 6 soldiers, armed and alert, their presence deliberate rather than coincidental. There was no avoiding combat. Vaelor took point, his wolf surging forward just enough to match human soldiers without revealing his full nature. The fighting was brutal in close quarters, the kind where training mattered less than raw determination. 2 of Ashenvale's fighters went down, their blood spreading across marble floors Vaelor had once walked without thinking about the cost. Corvin took a blade across the arm, the wound deep enough to compromise his grip. But they won through, leaving unconscious guards and blood-spattered stone behind them. "We can't sustain this," Kara gasped, binding Corvin's wound with torn cloth. "Every fight brings us closer to being overwhelmed. Then we move faster." Vaelor's eyes blazed gold. "3rd floor. Now!" They ascended in silence, broken only by labored breathing and the distant sounds of palace life continuing unaware of the assault happening in its depths. Servants moved through corridors carrying breakfast trays. Officials discussed policy in chambers that echoed with bureaucratic certainty. The machinery of empire grinding forward, regardless of the violence bleeding through its foundation. The 3rd floor corridor was different, heavily guarded. 8 soldiers stationed outside a reinforced door that practically screamed high-value prisoner. Vaelor didn't slow, didn't plan, just let instinct override strategy and charged. The soldiers barely had time to raise weapons before he was among them, fighting with a precision born from years of combat training and enhanced by wolf nature that made him faster, stronger, more relentless than human limitations allowed. Saris fought beside him, her movements lacking formal training but compensating with fierce determination. She used a guard's own momentum against him, drove an elbow into another's throat, fought like someone who'd learned survival in environments where technique was less important than refusing to stay down. The door guards fell, but not quietly. Alarms began to sound, deep bells that echoed through the palace like a death knell. They were out of time. Vaelor kicked open the reinforced door, expecting cells or torture chambers. Instead, he found a receiving room decorated with obscene luxury, and at its center, seated calmly as if waiting for tea, was Elira. She looked thinner than he remembered, exhaustion evident in the shadows under her eyes, but her posture remained perfect, her expression unreadable. "Vaelor," she said quietly, "you actually came. Did you doubt I would?" "Yes." Her honesty was sharp as glass. "You've made it abundantly clear that personal loyalty isn't your strength." The observation cut deeper than intended, carrying the weight of 6 months where he'd chosen everything except the people who needed him. "I'm getting you out," Vaelor said. "Why?" Elira stood slowly, her movements deliberate. "So you can salve your conscience? So you can pretend choosing the bond doesn't mean abandoning everyone else?" Vaelor was about to respond when footsteps thundered in the corridor outside. Heavy. Multiple units converging. They'd been expected. Elira's expression shifted to something almost like pity. "Did you really think Draymore would leave me unguarded? That he wouldn't anticipate exactly this move?" Understanding arrived like a blade between ribs. This was a trap. Elira wasn't a prisoner, she was bait, and he'd walked his people directly into the kill box. Draymore appeared in the doorway, flanked by 30 soldiers, his expression mixing triumph and contempt. His broken arm from the tunnel was splinted and bound, but it didn't diminish the predatory satisfaction radiating from him. "Welcome home, Vaelor," he said. "I was hoping you'd be predictable one last time." "Let them go," Vaelor said. "This is between us." "No. This is between you and every person whose life you've destroyed through your selfish choices." Draymore gestured, and more soldiers poured in, surrounding Vaelor's fighters completely. "You abandoned the Empire for a bond. Thousands died in the resulting chaos. And now you assault the palace with criminals and expect mercy? I expect justice." "Justice!"
Draymore laughed, the sound echoing off obsidian walls. Justice is what happens when a failed king finally faces consequences. He drew his blade and pointed it at Ceres, starting with her. Vaelor's world narrowed to a single point of absolute clarity. Draymore wanted to break him, wanted to make him watch Ceres die as payment for choosing the bond over duty, wanted to demonstrate that love was weakness and power was the only truth that mattered. But standing there, surrounded and outnumbered, bleeding from a dozen wounds and facing certain death, Vaelor understood something fundamental that 15 years of kingship had never taught him. Power wasn't what you controlled. It was what you were willing to lose. And he'd already lost everything that mattered except the people standing with him, which meant he had nothing left to hold back. Vaelor let the Apex transformation consume him completely, not partial, not controlled, but total. His body restructured with violence that made the guards step back. Bone cracked and reformed. Muscle expanded beyond human limitation. His eyes went from gold to something ancient and terrible, the color of predators that existed before civilization tried to tame the wild. This was what he'd suppressed for 15 years. The part of himself too dangerous to unleash because it couldn't be controlled or calculated or bent to strategy. This was what he actually was beneath the crown and the careful cultivation of power. And standing between Draymore's blade and Ceres, Vaelor finally let it free. The soldiers opened fire, crossbow bolts and arrows that should have ended him. But the Apex form moved faster than projectiles, each bolt missing by fractions as Vaelor closed distance with speed that defied physics. He reached Draymore in seconds, his hand closing around the man's sword arm with enough force to shatter bone. Draymore screamed, the sound mixing pain and disbelief. Vaelor barely heard it. His focus had narrowed to pure instinct. Protect, defend, destroy anything threatening what he valued. The soldiers rushed him en masse. What followed wasn't combat. It was demonstration of what happened when an Apex Alpha stopped pretending to be civilized. Vaelor tore through them like they were constructed of paper, each strike precise and devastating, his wolf nature singing with the rightness of violence and defense of pack, because that's what they were. Ceres, Corvin, Kara, Ashenvale's fighters who'd followed him into certain death, not subjects, not pawns, pack, and an alpha-protected pack above everything else. Blood painted the receiving room. Screams echoed off obsidian walls. Soldiers fell back, fear overriding training as they faced something their weapons couldn't stop and their minds couldn't comprehend. There is a particular terror that comes from facing something that exists outside your understanding of possible. These soldiers had trained against rebels, against coordinated assaults, against enemies that followed predictable patterns of attack and defense. They had not trained for facing a force of nature wearing human skin. Their discipline crumbled like sand before a tidal wave. And then Vaelor felt it, the bond flaring with warning. He turned to find Ceres on the ground, a guard's blade pressed against her throat, her eyes wide with fear and fury. The Apex form stuttered, hesitated. "Stand down!" Draymore gasped from where he'd fallen, cradling his broken arm against his chest. "Or she dies!" Vaelor froze, instinct warring with itself. The wolf screamed to attack, to rip out every throat between him and Ceres. But logic, cold and cruel, whispered that moving would get her killed. In that moment of hesitation, everything hung balanced on a knife's edge. Then Ceres's eyes met his, and she did something that changed the entire equation. She smiled. Not fear, not surrender, recognition, and mouthed two words, "Trust me." Then she drove her elbow back into the guard's solar plexus, used his moment of shock to twist away from the blade, and rolled clear just as Vaelor exploded forward with violence that made everything before look restrained. The guard went down. Draymore scrambled backward, the remaining soldiers broke and ran, self-preservation finally overriding orders. And in the chaos, Alira moved. She'd been so quiet, so still, that everyone had forgotten she was there. Now she picked up a fallen blade and pressed it against Draymore's throat with hands that didn't shake. "Enough," she said quietly. The entire room froze. Alira looked at Vaelor, her expression unreadable. "You came back for me. After everything. After I told you to leave. You came back. I owed you that much. You owed me nothing. We both entered this union knowing it was transactional." She pressed the blade slightly harder against Draymore's skin. "But you came anyway.
which means you've changed more than I thought possible. Illyra, Vaelor said carefully, letting the apex transformation recede until he was just a man again. What are you doing?
Making a choice I should have made months ago. She looked around the room at the blood and bodies and the wreckage of Draymor's trap. For 6 months, I've watched this empire tear itself apart because you rejected a bond, and I thought you were weak for it. Thought you destroyed everything for selfish desire. And now? Now I understand that the empire was already broken. She met his eyes. Because it was built on a foundation that required you to deny your own nature, and nothing sustainable can be built on that kind of denial. Draymor struggled weakly. This is treason. No. Illyra's voice was cold enough to freeze blood. This is revolution. She looked at Vaelor one last time, and in her eyes he saw something he'd never expected. Respect. Go, she said. Take your bond and your fighters and leave. I'll handle the aftermath. The palace is surrounded. We'll never make it out. Yes, you will, because I'm going to give you something I should have given you months ago. Illyra's smile was sharp as broken glass. A choice. She removed the blade from Draymor's throat and tossed it to Vaelor. The weapon clattered on marble between them. Kill him, Illyra said. Take back the throne. Rule as the king you used to be. Crush the rebellion. Restore order through force and fear. It's what you're good at, what you trained for, what 15 years of reign prepared you to do. She paused, her eyes never leaving his. Or walk away. Let the empire find its own path. Let me dismantle what you built and rebuild something better. Become who you're meant to be instead of who you were forced to become. The blade lay between them like an ultimatum. Vaelor looked at it, looked at Draymor cowering against the wall, his arms shattered, his coup crumbling. Looked at the throne that was his by right of conquest and blood, and 15 years of unquestioned rule. Then he looked at Ceres, standing amid the wreckage with trust in her eyes and blood on her hands, and absolute certainty that whatever he chose, she'd stand beside him, and made the choice that would define everything that came after. He stepped over the blade without touching it, turned his back on the throne, and reached for Ceres's hand. Behind him, he heard Illyra's quiet laugh. Finally, she said, "Finally, you chose right." "What will you do?" Vaelor asked. Illyra's expression hardened into something ruthless and determined. "Burn it down, the whole corrupt system. Then build something that doesn't require kings to destroy themselves to maintain it. And Draymor will stand trial, publicly, for attempting to seize power through terror." She looked at the broken man with contempt. "His execution will be the last one this empire conducts. After that, we change the rules." Vaelor nodded slowly. "You'll make a better ruler than I ever was. I'll make a different one. Whether that's better remains to be seen." She gestured toward the door. "Now go. You have maybe 10 minutes before the entire palace guard converges on this location." Vaelor moved toward the exit, Ashenvale's fighters regrouping around him. At the threshold, he paused. "Thank you," he said. Illyra met his eyes one last time. "Don't thank me, just live. Actually live instead of just ruling, and maybe that'll prove this was all worth something." Then alarms erupted through the entire palace, and Vaelor ran. They burst from the palace through servant corridors and hidden passages. Vaelor's memory finally serving them as guards poured toward the receiving room and away from their escape route. The eastern docks were chaos, boats loading supplies, merchants arguing prices, the normal machinery of commerce creating perfect cover. Vaelor commandeered a cargo vessel, the captain's protests dying when he saw the blood and the expression on Vaelor's face. They cast off as palace guards reached the docks, crossbows firing bolts that fell short into dark water. And as the capital receded behind them, Vaelor stood at the stern with Ceres's hand in his and watched everything he'd built disappear into morning mist. "You okay?" Ceres asked quietly. Vaelor considered the question honestly. He'd lost an empire, abandoned a throne, walked away from 15 years of power and certainty, and felt lighter than he had in his entire life. "Yeah," he said, "I think I finally am. Where do we go now?" "Wherever we want. No empire, no obligations, just us and whatever we choose to build." Ceres leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. "That sounds terrifying." "It does," Vaelor agreed. "Good," she smiled. "I'm tired of safe. The boat carried them west toward unclaimed territories and uncertain futures, and the terrifying freedom of having nothing left to lose and everything left to gain. Behind them, the Empire began its transformation. Ahead of them, everything was possible. And for the first time since the bond had snapped into place 6 months ago, Vaelor felt complete. Not because he'd won. The boat carried them west for 3 days before the pursuing ships appeared on the horizon. Vaelor had known they would come. Draymor's supporters wouldn't accept defeat quietly, and the Empire had resources he no longer commanded. What surprised him was how few ships gave chase. Just 2 vessels, their sails bearing marks he recognized from northern houses that had always opposed his rule. Not an empire's worth of fury, just the death throes of a failed coup. "They can't catch us," the captain said, studying the distant sails. "Wind's in our favor and this ship's built for speed. We'll reach the western territories before they're within firing range." Vaelor nodded but didn't relax. Victory wasn't reaching safety. It was understanding what came after. Saris found him at dawn on the 4th day, standing at the bow, watching light spread across water that stretched endless in every direction. "You didn't sleep," she said. "Couldn't. Still running scenarios?" "Old habits." Vaelor turned to face her. 15 years of calculating threats doesn't disappear overnight. Maybe it shouldn't. She moved beside him, her shoulder touching his. The trick isn't stopping the analysis. It's deciding what to do with it. And what should I do with the knowledge that we're being pursued by forces that won't stop until we're dead or captured? "Live anyway." Her voice was matter-of-fact. "We've been running toward death since we left Ashenvale. The only difference now is we're doing it together." The observation carried weight that had nothing to do with philosophy and everything to do with the bond pulsing steady between them. Not the desperate pull of incomplete connection, but the settled certainty of 2 people who'd finally stopped fighting what they were. There is a particular kind of peace that only arrives after surviving what should have destroyed you. Not the absence of threat, but the recognition that you've already endured worse and emerged changed but intact. Vaelor felt it settling into his bones, replacing the constant vigilance that had defined 15 years of rule with something quieter and infinitely more sustainable. The Western Territories appeared on the 5th day, a coastline of rough cliffs and scattered settlements that existed outside imperial control. No formal government, no structured hierarchy. Just communities of people who'd chosen freedom over security and paid the cost in isolation and constant struggle. The captain guided them into a natural harbor protected by rock formations that made pursuit suicidal for anyone who didn't know the channels. "This is as far as I go," he said, once they'd secured the boat. "Got cargo to deliver south and no desire to get caught in whatever storm you're bringing." "Understood." Vaelor handed him a pouch of coin, more than the passage was worth. "Thank you for not asking questions." The captain weighed the pouch, then looked at Vaelor with eyes that had seen enough to recognize truth. "You're that king, aren't you? The one who walked away from the throne for a bond." "Former king." The captain grunted. "Takes more spine to walk away from power than to hold it. Most men never learn that." He pocketed the coin. "Good luck out here. You're going to need it." They disembarked with Ashenvale's remaining fighters, 13 people who'd survived tunnel collapses and palace assaults, and deserved rest that probably wouldn't come. The settlement above the harbor was called Breakwater, a name that suggested both function and philosophy. Buildings clung to cliffsides like barnacles, connected by rope bridges and staircases carved directly into rock. The people moved with the cautious efficiency of those accustomed to hardship. Corvin studied the terrain with an engineer's critical eye. Defensible, limited access points, but isolated. If those ships catch up, we'd be trapped. "Then we make sure they don't," Vaelor said. "How?" "By doing what I should have done months ago." He looked at Saris. "Stop running and start building." They spent 2 weeks integrating into Breakwater, learning its rhythms and contributing what skills they possessed. Vaelor worked construction, his strength useful for projects that required moving stone or timber. Saris established a small clinic, her medical knowledge desperately needed in a community that relied on folk remedies and hope. The settlement's unofficial leader was a woman named Merrick, weathered and sharp-eyed, who'd founded Breakwater 20 years prior after watching her family destroyed in imperial border conflicts. "You're the king who abandoned his throne," she said the first time they spoke, not bothering with preamble or courtesy. Former king, Vaelor corrected. Merrick snorted. Semantics. You ruled an empire, made decisions that affected millions, then walked away when it got complicated. What makes you think you're welcome here? I don't think I'm welcome. I'm asking permission to stay and contribute. Why should I grant it? Vaelor met her eyes. Because I have skills your settlement needs. Because I'm done building empires and ready to build something smaller and more sustainable. And because the forces pursuing me will eventually find this place whether I'm here or not. At least if I stay, I can help defend it. Merrick studied him for a long moment. You know what we do to people who bring trouble here? I can guess. And you're staying anyway? Yes. She nodded slowly. You get one chance. Bring value or bring nothing, but the moment you become a liability, you're gone. Understood? Understood. Merrick turned to leave, then paused. That bond of yours, the one that destroyed an empire, was it worth it? Vaelor looked across the settlement to where Saris was organizing medical supplies, her movements efficient and purposeful, and felt the bond hum with contentment that had nothing to do with passion and everything to do with rightness. Ask me in a year, he said. Merrick's expression might have been a smile. Fair enough. The pursuing ships arrived 3 weeks later. They anchored outside the harbor, too large to navigate the channels, and sent a small boat ashore carrying a single representative. Vaelor met him on the beach, alone, though he could feel Breakwater's fighters positioned in the rocks above, crossbows ready. The representative was young, wearing armor that marked him as Northern House infantry. His expression mixed determination with barely concealed fear. Lord Vaelor Draven, he began formally. Just Vaelor now. The representative blinked, thrown off script. I bring terms from Lord Keston of House Northmarch. Return to the capital for trial. Face judgment for abandoning the Empire during crisis. Accept responsibility for the thousands who died in the resulting chaos. And if I refuse, then Lord Keston will blockade this settlement until you're handed over. No trade, no supplies. The people here will starve rather than protect a traitor. Vaelor felt anger flare, old instincts screaming to demonstrate what happened when people issued ultimatums to alphas. But he forced it down, forced himself to think beyond immediate violence. How many died? He asked quietly. What? In the chaos after I left. How many actually died? The representative hesitated. Reports vary. 3,000? Maybe 5. The Southern Uprising was brutal, and how many would have died if I'd stayed and crushed the rebellion through force? The representative had no answer for that. Tell Lord Keston his terms are refused, Vaelor said, and tell him that if he blockades this settlement, I'll sink every ship he sends and personally deliver his head to whatever's left of the Imperial Council. That's a declaration of war. No. That's a statement of fact. Vaelor stepped closer. I walked away from the Empire because ruling through fear and violence was destroying everything I touched. But that doesn't mean I've forgotten how. If Keston wants war, I'll give him war, and I promise it'll be the last mistake he makes. The representative retreated to his boat without another word. Merrick appeared beside Vaelor as the boat rowed back toward the ships. Big talk for a man with 13 fighters, she said. It's not talk. Vaelor watched the ships. It's calculation. Keston doesn't have Imperial backing. If he did, he'd have sent a fleet, not 2 vessels. This is a gamble by a minor house trying to gain favor by delivering me to whoever's currently claiming authority. And if you're wrong, then we fight. Vaelor turned to her. And we win or we die, but we don't surrender. Merrick's expression was unreadable. You're either very brave or very stupid. Can it be both? She laughed, sharp and genuine. Maybe you'll fit here after all. The ship stayed anchored for 2 days, a constant presence on the horizon. Then, on the 3rd morning, they were gone. Scouts confirmed they'd sailed south, back toward Imperial waters. Either Keston decided the cost was too high, Corvin said, or he's gathering reinforcements. Vaelor studied the empty horizon. Or Alira sent word that pursuing me was pointless, that the Empire has bigger problems than one former king living in exile. You think she'd do that? I think she's smart enough to understand that martyring me would create more problems than it solved. Vaelor turned away from the water. Either way, we bought time. Time for what? To figure out what comes next. Basat. What came next was slower and harder than any campaign Vaelor had ever conducted. Building in Breakwater required different skills than ruling an empire. No grand strategies, no sweeping reforms, just daily decisions about resource allocation and dispute resolution, and how to expand infrastructure without overextending limited supplies. Vaelor found himself in meetings that would have seemed trivial 6 months ago. Arguing about fishing rights, negotiating access to fresh water, mediating conflicts between families that had been feuding since before he arrived. It was tedious and frustrating and occasionally mind-numbing. It was also more satisfying than anything he'd done as king, because these decisions affected people he knew, people whose faces he recognized, people who'd look him in the eye and tell him when his ideas were stupid. There was no insulation of hierarchy, no layers of advisors filtering information until it arrived sanitized and simplified. Just direct confrontation with the messy reality of human community. One evening, 3 months into their residency, Saris found him sitting on a cliff overlooking the harbor, watching sunset paint the water in shades of copper and gold. "You're thinking too loud," she said, settling beside him. "Just processing." "What specifically? How different this is?" Vaelor gestured toward the settlement. "As king, I made decisions that affected millions, but I never had to face most of them. Never had to see the consequences up close. Here, every choice has a face attached. Every mistake costs someone I've shared meals with. And that bothers you? It should have bothered me before." The observation came out quiet, edged with regret. All those years ruling from a throne, reducing people to statistics and strategic resources. I told myself it was necessary, that effective leadership required emotional distance. But I was lying to myself. Distance didn't make me more effective. It made me more cruel. Easier to sacrifice what you can't see. Saris was quiet for a moment, her hand finding his. "You're different now. Am I? Or am I just in an environment where cruelty has immediate consequences? Does the reason matter if the result is better?" The question settled between them, unanswerable in its simplicity. There is a particular humility that arrives when you realize the person you were was fundamentally broken. Not evil, necessarily, but operating from assumptions that seemed logical at the time and revealed themselves as monstrous in retrospect. Vaelor had spent months grappling with that recognition. Understanding that every decision he'd made as king was filtered through a framework that valued control over humanity, strategy over connection. "I don't know how to forgive myself," he admitted. "For the choices I made, the people I hurt, the bond I nearly destroyed because I was too proud to admit I needed something I couldn't control." Saris leaned her head against his shoulder. "Maybe forgiveness isn't the point. Then what is? Being different going forward. Making choices that prove you've learned. And if I fail, then you try again." She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting sunset. "That's what being human means, Vaelor. Failing and failing better. You spent 15 years trying to be something more than human. Maybe it's time to accept that being human is enough." The observation hit with the force of fundamental truth. Vaelor had spent his entire adult life reaching for something beyond ordinary limitation, building an empire that would outlast him, establishing power that couldn't be challenged, becoming a name that inspired fear and respect in equal measure. And in the process, he'd lost sight of what actually mattered. Connection, community, the small daily choices that accumulated into a life worth living. "I love you," he said suddenly. Saris smiled. "I know." "No, I mean, I love you in ways I don't have words for. You saw me at my worst and stayed anyway. You challenged every assumption I built my identity on. You made me want to be better even when I didn't know how. That's what bonds do. They make you see yourself clearly, and once you see clearly, you can't pretend anymore." Vaelor pulled her closer, feeling the bond settle between them like a foundation everything else could build on. "Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for finally choosing me." They sat together as darkness fell and stars emerged, two people who'd survived impossible odds and come out the other side changed but intact. Said, the message arrived 6 months after they'd settled in Breakwater. A courier bearing imperial seals, his presence causing immediate tension throughout the settlement. Vaelor met him in Merrick's dwelling, surrounded by Breakwater's council and Ashenvale's fighters. The courier handed over a sealed letter without ceremony. Vaelor broke the seal and read in silence, then read again to make sure he'd understood correctly. "What is it?" Saris asked. "An invitation." Vaelor looked up, his expression complicated. "From Alira. She's requesting my presence at a gathering of territorial leaders. Says she wants me there as witness to what the Empire is becoming." "Witness or participant?" "Witness. Specifically states I'm not being asked to resume any authority. Just to observe." Merrick leaned forward. "It's a trap." "Maybe." Vaelor studied the letter. "Or it's genuine." Alira was always more interested in functional governance than personal revenge. "You trust her?" "I trust that she's smart enough to know that killing me now would accomplish nothing. The Empire has moved on. I'm irrelevant to whatever she's building." The word irrelevant hung in the air, carrying weight that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with ego. 6 months ago, being irrelevant would have felt like death. Now it felt like freedom. "Are you going?" Saris asked. Vaelor looked at her, reading the concern in her eyes. "Only if you come with me." "That's a terrible idea, probably. But I'm done making decisions that exclude you. We go together or not at all?" Saris held his gaze, then nodded slowly. "Together." Merrick shook her head. "You're both insane." "We've established that," Vaelor said. "Question is whether you'll let us borrow a boat." The gathering was held in neutral territory, a fortress city called Greyhaven that sat at the convergence of 3 major rivers. Delegates from across the former empire arrived with varying degrees of suspicion and hostility, representing territories that had declared independence during the chaos. Vaelor and Saris entered anonymously, dressed in simple traveling clothes that drew no attention. They found seats in the observer gallery, watching as Alira took the central platform. She looked different, thinner, harder, the weight of 6 months governing a fracturing empire evident in every line of her face. But when she spoke, her voice carried absolute authority. "We are not here to rebuild what was," she began. "The old empire was built on foundations that required constant violence to maintain, hierarchies that demanded subjugation, systems that treated people as resources to be managed rather than individuals to be valued." Murmurs rippled through the assembly. "I propose something different." Alira's eyes swept the room, a confederation of autonomous territories, linked by trade and mutual defense, but governing themselves according to their own values and needs. No central throne, no single authority claiming dominion over all. "That's chaos," someone shouted from the assembly. "No." Alira's voice was steel. "That's freedom." What we had before was control masquerading as stability, and it collapsed the moment its foundation cracked. She continued outlining her vision, detailing frameworks for dispute resolution and resource sharing that preserved autonomy while preventing the isolation that made small territories vulnerable. Vaelor listened with growing respect. This was what he'd failed to imagine during his reign, not because the idea was complex, but because it required releasing control he'd never been willing to surrender. Alira was proposing to dismantle the very concept of empire in favor of something messier and more sustainable. During a break in proceedings, Alira found them in the gallery. "Vaelor," she said quietly, "thank you for coming. Thank you for inviting me." She looked at Saris. "And you must be the bond that changed everything." Saris met her gaze steadily. "I'm just someone who happened to be in the wrong place at the right time." Alira's expression might have been a smile. "I think you underestimate your impact." She turned back to Vaelor. "What do you think of the proposal?" "It's brilliant. And impossible." "Why impossible?" "Because it requires people to voluntarily limit their own power, to trust that cooperation serves them better than domination." Vaelor shook his head. "I couldn't have imagined this 6 months ago, let alone implemented it." "That's because you were trying to rule alone." Alira gestured toward the assembly. "This only works if everyone has stake in its success, if power is distributed instead of concentrated. And if someone tries to seize control anyway, then the Confederation responds collectively." She met his eyes. "No single tyrant can dominate when power is shared among equals." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the entrance, raised voices, the sound of weapons being drawn. Vaelor's instincts flared. A group of armed men forced their way into the hall, led by a figure Vaelor recognized immediately. Lord Keston, the northern lord who'd pursued them to Breakwater.
He strode to the center of the assembly, his expression mixing fury and desperation. "This gathering is a farce," Keston announced. "You speak of confederation and cooperation while the man responsible for our suffering sits among us unpunished." He pointed directly at Vaelor. Vaelor Draven abandoned the Empire in its moment of greatest need. Thousands died because he valued personal desire over duty. And now he sits here as honored guest while we debate the future he destroyed? The assembly erupted into chaos. Vaelor stood slowly, every eye in the room turning to him. "Lord Keston is correct," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "I did abandon the Empire. I chose the bond over duty. And yes, people died as a result." The admission shocked the room into silence. "But I did not cause the instability that followed." Vaelor's voice was steady. "I revealed it. The Empire was already fracturing because it was built on systems that required constant domination to maintain. My leaving didn't create the chaos. It exposed the inherent weakness of governing through fear." "That's a rationalization," Keston spat. "You're trying to justify cowardice." "No." Vaelor stepped forward. "I'm acknowledging that the person I was, the king I tried to be, was fundamentally flawed, and that continuing to rule from that broken foundation would have caused more suffering than walking away." "So you face no consequences? Bear no responsibility?" "I face them every day." Vaelor's voice dropped. "Every person who died during the uprising is a weight I carry. Every family torn apart by the chaos is a debt I can never repay. But punishing me doesn't resurrect the dead or repair what's broken. It just satisfies your need for vengeance." Keston drew his blade. "Then I'll settle for satisfaction." Vaelor didn't move, didn't reach for a weapon, just stood there, unarmed and undefended, and met Keston's eyes. "If killing me will help you move forward," he said quietly, "then do it. But know that it changes nothing except giving you one more death to carry." The silence that followed was absolute. Keston stood frozen, blade raised, his expression cycling through rage and confusion, and something that might have been recognition. Then Ceres stepped forward, positioning herself between them. "No," she said simply. "Move," Keston snarled. "No." Ceres's voice was absolute. "You want to kill him? You go through me first. This doesn't concern you. It concerns me more than anyone." Ceres stepped closer. "I'm the bond he chose. The reason thousands died. If you need someone to blame, blame me. That's not how this works. Isn't it?" Her voice carried steel. "You're angry because the empire you knew collapsed, because the certainty you relied on disappeared, and you want someone to pay for that loss. But killing Vaelor won't restore what you lost. It'll just prove that violence is still your only answer." Keston's hand trembled on the blade. "Put it down," Elira said from the platform. "This gathering is about building something new, not relitigating old grudges." He destroyed everything. "No." He revealed what was already broken. Elira's voice was firm, "and gave us the opportunity to build something better. If you can't see that, then you're not ready for what we're creating here." Keston looked around the assembly, seeing no support, no reinforcement for his fury. Slowly, he lowered the blade. "This isn't over," he said. "Yes, it is," Vaelor replied quietly. "I'm not your enemy anymore, Keston. I'm just a man trying to live with the consequences of choices I can't unmake. You can spend your life hating me, or you can help build what comes next. But you can't do both." Keston stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned and left, his followers trailing behind. The assembly exhaled collectively. Elira returned to the platform. "As I was saying, the old empire is dead. The question is what we build on its ashes. Confederation or chaos? Cooperation or endless conflict? The choice is ours." The debate continued for hours, territories arguing details and frameworks, but the fundamental direction was set. No central authority, no throne. Just autonomous regions linked by agreements that could be modified or dissolved based on mutual consent. It was messy and complicated and would probably fail a dozen times before succeeding, but it was also honest in ways the Empire never was. They stayed in Greyhaven for 3 days, watching the Confederation take shape through endless negotiation and compromise. On the third evening, Elira found them again. "Walk with me,"
she said. They followed her through fortress gardens that showed signs of recent battle, scorched stone and hastily repaired walls telling stories of conflicts already fading into history. "I never thanked you," Vaelor said finally. "For what? For leaving, for choosing the bond, for breaking the empire in ways that forced us to rebuild better. I didn't do it for noble reasons. I know. You did it because you were selfish and desperate and finally honest about what you needed." She looked at him. "And sometimes selfish honesty creates better outcomes than strategic nobility." The observation settled between them, strange and true. "Will it work?" Vaelor asked. "The Confederation?" Vaelor shrugged. "Maybe. Maybe not. But at least we're trying something that doesn't require constant violence to maintain. And if it fails, then we try again. Learn from the mistakes. Iterate." She smiled. "Turns out empires aren't built to last, but communities might be." They walked in silence for a while, three people who'd been bound by political necessity and emerged as something almost like friends. "What will you do now?" Vaelor asked. "Go back to Breakwater. Build something small and sustainable. Let the Empire, Confederation, whatever it becomes, continue without me. No ambitions of returning to power?" Vaelor looked at Ceres, saw her smile, and felt the bond settle with contentment that had nothing to do with thrones or authority. "I had power," he said. "It cost me everything that mattered. I'd rather have this. This being? A life where I know the people I'm building with, where decisions have faces attached, where I can fail and try again without thousands paying for my mistakes." Vaelor nodded slowly. "That's wisdom I never expected from you." "Me neither," Vaelor admitted, "but surviving what should have destroyed me taught lessons that ruling never could." They parted at the garden's edge, Elira returning to negotiations that would determine the shape of territories for generations, Vaelor and Ceres heading back to the small inn where they'd been staying. That night, lying in darkness with Ceres beside him, Vaelor felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years of rule: peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the acceptance of limits, the recognition that some things couldn't be controlled or dominated, only experienced and cherished. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For seeing who I could be when I couldn't see it myself, for refusing to let me hide behind power and strategy, for making me choose." Ceres turned to face him in the darkness. "You chose yourself, Vaelor. I just gave you permission to be honest about it." The observation carried truth that rewrote everything he thought he understood about strength and weakness, power and vulnerability. He'd spent 15 years building an empire on the belief that control was strength and need was weakness. But standing here in the wreckage of that philosophy, having lost everything and gained what mattered, Vaelor understood the fundamental lie he'd been living. Strength wasn't dominating others. It was being honest about what you needed and choosing it even when the cost seemed unbearable. Power wasn't controlling outcomes. It was accepting that some things were beyond control and building anyway. And love, the thing he'd dismissed as weakness, was actually the only force strong enough to survive the collapse of everything else. "I love you," he said. "I know." Ceres smiled in the darkness. "And tomorrow we'll go home and keep building something better than what we left behind." Home. The word settled over him like a benediction. Not a throne or a palace or an empire spanning territories. Just a settlement clinging to cliffs where people knew his name and called him on his mistakes and valued him for what he contributed rather than what he controlled. That was worth more than any crown. They returned to Breakwater 2 weeks later to find the settlement expanded, new structures built in their absence. The community growing through word of mouth that spread stories of a place where people could build lives outside imperial control. Merrick met them at the harbor. "You're back," she said. "Wasn't sure you would be. Where else would we go?" Vaelor gestured to the settlement. "This is home now." Merrick studied him, her expression unreadable. "You mean that?" "Yes." "Good. Because we've got a dozen new families who need housing and a fresh water system that's barely keeping up with demand." She handed him a rough blueprint. "Think you can help with that?" Vaelor took the plans, studying the proposed expansion with an engineer's eye. "I can try. That's all anyone can do." Merrick turned to leave, then paused. "Welcome home, Vaelor." The words carried weight that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with belonging. They spent the next months building, expanding infrastructure, mediating disputes, living the daily reality of community that required showing up and contributing and accepting that perfection wasn't the goal, just incremental improvement. Ceres's clinic grew, her reputation spreading until people traveled days to receive treatment they couldn't get elsewhere. Vaelor worked construction and conflict resolution, his strategic mind finding purpose in solving smaller, more immediate problems. And in the spaces between work, they built a life that had nothing to do with bonds or destiny or forces beyond their control. Just two people choosing each other daily and building something that mattered. One evening, a year after they'd arrived in Breakwater, Vaelor stood on the same cliff where he'd once questioned everything he'd become. Ceres found him there, as she always did. "Thinking?" she asked. "Reflecting." Vaelor gestured toward the settlement. "A year ago, I was an emperor. I commanded armies, made decisions affecting millions, sat on a throne that represented absolute power. And now? Now I spend my days arguing about fishing rights and building housing for people whose names I know. And I've never been happier." Ceres leaned against him. "That's because you finally figured out what matters, which is being part of something instead of ruling over it, contributing instead of controlling, building with people instead of building for them." The observation carried truth that would have seemed incomprehensible to the man he'd been. But standing here, feeling the bond pulse steady between them, surrounded by a community that valued him for what he gave rather than what he commanded, Vaelor understood that the empire had never been the goal. Connection was the goal. Community was the goal. Being known and valued and challenged and supported by people who saw you clearly and chose you anyway. That was worth more than all the power in the world. "Do you have any regrets?" Ceres asked. "Only that it took me so long to learn." Vaelor pulled her close. "But I'm grateful for the lesson, even if it cost me everything else." "Was it worth it?" He looked at the settlement, at the life they'd built, at the woman who'd refused to let him hide behind strategic nobility. "Every second," he said, and meant it with everything he was. The sun set over Breakwater, painting the water in shades of copper and gold, and Vaelor stood there with the bond settled between them like a foundation strong enough to build anything on. No throne, no empire, no power beyond what he contributed daily, just a man and the woman he'd chosen, building something small and real and infinitely more valuable than anything he'd commanded before. The empire could have its new confederation, could experiment with governing structures that distributed power instead of concentrating it. Vaelor had found something better. He'd found home. And in the end, that was the only victory that mattered.